Okay, now we're moving on to agenda item number 6. Yeah, and yes. So I'm going to ask Ms. Sarek to tell us about this, because this is a little bit separate from our pathways to licensure and stuff. So.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. Behind the memo, behind tab number 6, starting with page 1, is language that at the top says psychological assistance regulations for SB 1193 implementation. This is to implement changes to the statute that will be made when or if when our Sunset Extension Bill is signed. It is currently in enrollment to the governor. The governor has until September 30th to either sign, not take action, or veto legislation. So in anticipation of a signature or the bill becoming law, we will need to put out some regulatory language to implement the bill. And the hearing, the committee will need to consider the language in the packet, which is on pages 1 through 4 of the meeting materials, and that was behind the memo. And then that language that the committee approves will then go to a regulatory hearing before the November board meeting. And the board will then consider the language for adoption at the November meeting. So I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the process, where we are, and why the committee is being presented with the language.
All right. Is there any thank you, Ms. Sarek. Is there any discussion about this? I want to go through this and kind of see what it's saying. There are a couple of questions I had in here.
And maybe I can get clarification from staff or Ms. Sarek. Are we planning on going over a system similar to BBS, where when somebody gets a psychological assistance registration, they have one number, and that number will apply for all supervisors that they have in subsequent psych assistantships? Okay. Obviously, it would still not get rid of the responsibility if it's postdoctoral experience for them to have a plan in place, and if they should change supervisors, for that supervisor to propose a new plan. Is that, you know what I'm saying? There's a plan of training. Let's say you were a psych assistant with Dr. A, and you moved to being a psych assistant with Dr. B under the same number. What would be required of Dr. B under these regs in order for them to use the psych assistant who already has a registration number?
Okay, what we're looking at is that if the psych assistant is changing supervisors or location, they have to notify the board. They will need to sign a new agreement with their new supervisor. That will still be required. We don't require them to submit that documentation to us, but at the time that they are submitting their hours for verification for licensure, then they would submit it at that time.
And if they are postdoctoral hours, they will have to have the plan of supervision that
They will still be required to have the plan signed by the primary supervisor.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other things? There are a couple things that I had. So, all right, so if we look at Part A, wait. 1391.1, let's start there. By submitting an application on Form XXX. So what was Ms. Marks told us is if we don't have a specific form listed, so we could say it's well, first of all, if we don't have a specific form listed, then we have to specify everything that would go in the form. If we title the form, we have to still put a date by it. So I was thinking that maybe we could title it, psych assistant application form, and then we don't have to change. But she said, unless we put everything that's required there, we have to put a date or we have to put a specific form number. Does that make sense? Okay.
So we could describe what the form would require and not necessarily have to give a date or a specific name to the form?
Right.
Okay, well, that might be a more practical way to approach it, so we don't have to go back and get legislative change.
Every time.
We
Yeah.
change the form.
So that's
It would be regular, make a
a
regular.
regulatory change, but still, we're talking, a year or longer, so. We might,
I do want to add, if you're talking about changing, say, the name of the governor because there's a new governor or something like that, that's on the top of the form, that can be done by what's called a Section 100 change, which is making a change without any regulatory effect. And that is really more of a ministerial process and does not take the year or whatever, however long it takes.
so if we did put a year in there, what you're saying is that we could change that pretty easily.
Correct. If you're not adding a requirement that the applicant has to provide or making any substantive change, if you change the logo, for example, of the board, and you want to change the logo on the form, or there's a new governor, or the name of the agency changes, all those kinds of things which have no real regulatory effect can be done by a Section 100, and as I said, that's more ministerial and is done completely on the staff level.
But if we change something in the form,
If you changed anything substantive, like deciding that the applicant needs to provide, a particular kind of address or a certain kind of document, then that would have to go through
A
the regular
regulatory
rulemaking. But that's probably the same as if you list all the
true.
requirements, because you'd have to do the same thing.
okay, so any way we look at it, unless it's just something like we're changing the logo, changing the name of the governor, whatever, it's going to require a regulatory change. So why don't we maybe title it?
So a procedural question for Noreen, do we have to, in order to post the rulemaking, do we have to have the form for the initial rulemaking package?
You would, if it's not incorporated by reference with a form number, then you would probably use it as an underlying document, but not, you wouldn't be needing to, and then you'd have to have it available in the rulemaking file, but it's not incorporated by reference, and you would not need to name it in the notice, but it would be considered underlying document.
So for purposes of publication, you have the notice, the initial statement of reasons, the proposed language, and then a form, the form that we are referring to.
If it's an underlying document, that presumes that you are relying on that document as part of the rulemaking. So it's contained in the rulemaking file, but it's not filed with OAL. And it wouldn't be considered one of the documents that you would send to the interested parties list.
So
Does that
what
make
is,
sense?
I'm sorry.
Does that make sense?
No. Sorry.
Well, I would think that either way, it'd be considered an underlying document, a document that you're kind of relying on in order to either list out what's in the regulation, or if it's just has a form number which is incorporated by reference. It's an underlying document, it's part of the file, so when there's like a title or a table of contents in the beginning of the rulemaking file that tells you what's in there. One of those items might be underlying data or an underlying document. So it's included in the file, so if somebody asks to look at it, but it's not a document that's filed with OAL at the time of initiating the rulemaking.
Got it. So for purposes of the hearing and for the November meeting where the board would consider adopting the language, we wouldn't have to have the form completed for their review and approval, or we would. And if the answer is yes, then would we need that approved now, which we don't have it now, or would we need it approved at the November meeting when the board considers the language?
Right, it's not, if it's incorporated by reference with a form number, then I would think you would need it at the time the board is reviewing the language, because you are incorporating that form by reference.
Okay.
If you're not, you're still going to have to list out what is going to be contained in the form. Then the board, you may still be working on how to format it, et cetera. I wouldn't necessarily think that the board would need to approve it at that time. I'm still of the opinion, excuse me, still of the opinion that even in that case, you may need to list it as an underlying document, but I will check on that. I know if it's incorporated by reference, it needs to be listed in the notice. And then I think it presumes that the board has seen it because it's being incorporated as part of the regulatory language.
So which are we going to do? Are we going to title it with a date, psychological assistant registration form, and then put the date? Or are we going to have a form number? Because that's the first thing that we have to decide, right?
Actually, Dr. Horn, though, I guess I'm confused a little bit now. Listen to
Okay.
Ms. Marks, it sounds like if we had that form number, we'd have to have a form we're looking at to create, right? So I don't know, if we did that, we still would need to spell out what is in the form because we don't have a form that we're looking at.
If we-
Right, am I missing it?
If you have a form, if it says form, PA for psych assistants or something along those lines, PSB, revised date, September 16, something along those lines, then you don't need to list out all of the data points that will be contained in the form.
Right, but we would have to have the form in front of us to be looking at it as a board because we're not,
Certainly at the time of adoption, a final adoption, I would think so.
So in November, so we could say now we're gonna, if we said now we're gonna call
but wait,
it-
but before, but,
I'm just trying to clarify.
because I guess, but then I'm thinking it, but you're asking us to approve it, to move it forward. We don't have a form to approve without talking about the data points. So it just seems a little awkward to present to the November regulatory process or the hearing we would have. Because as a committee, we're gonna approve it, but we don't know what the data points are. So we'd have to discuss data points even if we were gonna name it, right?
Well, we have to, yeah, exactly.
Unless we,
Well,
Unless we date it,
okay.
yeah.
But if we're saying a form, that's the name of it, we're approving a form that we don't know what includes what's on the
We
form?
don't have you're exactly right. We aren't saying, we're just saying, this form number, at this point in time, if we were to just say, okay about this, we say, submitting an application on form PSB 916 or something. We have no idea what's going to be in that form at this point in time. It would come to the board in November. That would be when we would find out what's in there. And then we could make changes to it, I guess, but if we're having a regulatory hearing, we can't.
Well, the board, generally, the board approves language for noticing. In my opinion, that is not absolutely required. The board does absolutely have to adopt the language at the back end
Okay.
before it can become effective. staff could initiate a rulemaking without the board seeing it. The board does have to adopt the final language, including the form if it's incorporated by reference. For the most part, even with this board, you approve the language prior to noticing. You could, under these circumstances, because you have a fairly good idea of what's going to be in the form, decide to approve the regulatory change without seeing the form. You will have, excuse me again, if it is incorporated by reference, you will have to approve it, you will have to adopt the final language with the form at the back end. Now, it depends on your comfort level, I guess would be the best way to phrase it, with saying, okay, let's go forward with a regulatory change because of the circumstances that we have here. If we don't like the form in November, we'll do a 15-day modification. It is a little bit contrary to what your practice has been, which is to approve the language and whatever incorporated documents there are prior to noticing, but in my opinion, it's not absolutely required.
Would it be helpful if Ms. Johnson were to talk to the committee about what is on the current psych assistant application, and if there are any differences that there would be in this application? Would that be helpful? Okay.
Sure. Thank you. Yes.
That's the application for licensure. Yeah. The whole application will need to be reconfigured, because currently it's to employ a psych assistant. We're changing it to where the applicant will be submitting the application. So we'll
it's
have to take out all the
essentially
employer.
to be a psychological
Yeah,
assistant.
so we'll need to modify, because the first section is employer section on this. We'll want that to be the psych assistant information.
So we're gonna have
Yeah.
the psych assistant information, so can you, is the psych assistant information there?
It's on the next page.
Okay, could you go to the next page?
This is information on the supervisor. We'll still need to have that information.
Okay.
'Cause
So
when they
here's
first
the
apply,
psych
they'll
assistant. So that's
and-
gonna be our first information,
Would be who is the psych assistant, who will be the person submitting the application.
aliases, residents.
So section 3 would really be the first section.
Yes. We will need addresses where services will be rendered. We'll need that information.
Okay.
And then the supervisor information above, we'll still have to keep the military question. And then we have all of the information about their degree. We'll want all that information as well, because they'll still need to document or verify their education. We have questions for the psych assistant, kind of the standard questions, conviction questions, some of the questions that come off can't have a familiar relationship with your supervisor, you can't rent space, all of that information will need to remain the same. Now, there's a supervisor questionnaire. We should still have the supervisor at the time of the application answer all of those questions, also sign the application with the psych assistant. And then we will have a form that will be required that they submit if they change supervisors or if they change employment, that they'll need to submit to us. like an address change, but we'll need to have the supervisor sign that as well.
So this will be one form with a lot of different sections on it? Or will these be different forms?
The notification form will be a different form that they would submit to us if they're changing supervisors or changing location, because they'll be able to take their registration to whatever location they're going to be working at. They'll also, right? Oh, you looked
Would
at me.
they also want to complete a new questionnaire if their supervisor changes, so they can sit down
Yes.
and go through the yes or no questions?
Yeah.
We haven't quite gone over all the requirements that will be on that form.
Okay, just say,
But yes, that would,
We'll just say Form XXX and let's
Mhm.
do something for us for November. Yeah.
I mean, it would be possible to have a new form by the November meeting, just a matter of going and reformatting and changing it around.
So I think as we see this, we're in agreement that we can go on with the XXX, kind of
Okay.
understanding what is going to be there, the kind of thing that'll be there, and have y'all do the wording, because if it's more than one form, we need to do it, or, however, whatever looks best.
And if we could just include in this form a change of supervisor or change of address, so that if we're capturing the same data, we could just add an additional section for people that are just changing their supervisor, right? So we wouldn't need to have two separate forms with essentially the same information. The only thing that wouldn't be changing is the registration number for the psych assistant and their mailing address or address of record.
But then they're gonna have to go through
But
and
they have to
answer
go
all
through
those
the thing with the new
questions.
supervisor.
Right, but the rest of it would still be relevant. They'd still have to fill out the questionnaire portion.
You could say, I mean, I think you can do it as many forms are designed where they'll say, if this is just for this
Yeah.
purpose, please skip to section 3.
Correct,
Right.
correct.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to find a way out of putting two forms in there.
Fine. I think we're satisfied, this looks fine, we understand, and, we'll see what comes in November, I guess.
But I do think as we talk about this as whatever packet of information, I think a hard copy would
Yeah,
help,
just to let us
help board
see
members
what-
to know what we're
If you
talking
don't
about.
have the form ready
We should
at
have the
that
form ready.
time, then bring this,
Yes.
so that will not.
So we will definitely have a draft form for the board to consider in November when you guys consider adopting the language.
Good, thanks.
Yes.
Okay, so the other thing I have, a couple of things. It's under 1391.6 Supervisor's Responsibility, Part A. It says, this is an awkward sentence, we've said it better in Pathways to Licensure. What we're saying is ensuring that the extent, kind, and quality of the psychological functions performed by the assistant are consistent with the supervisor's training and experience. That's actually not what we're doing. We want to ensure that the supervisor's training and experience qualifies him or her to supervise the psych assistant in whatever areas the psych assistant is being supervised in. It's just a little flip. It's not, they probably aren't consistent with the supervisor's training and experience. The supervisor will have had more training, more experience, but it's the other way that the supervisor does have the training and experience to supervise the psych assistant in these areas. We actually said it in Pathways to Licensure, if I can find it. I thought we said it better. Here we go. Ensure that they have the education, training, and experience in the areas of psychological practice for which they will supervise. That's what we're really saying. And we have said that in the pathways to licensure under responsibilities of primary supervisor or something, I think it's called, let's see. And it's, a delegated supervisor shall comply with all the following requirements. And one is ensure that they have the education, training, and experience in the areas of psychological practice for which they supervise. So here, I think we're wanting to say every supervisor of a psych assistant needs to have the education, training, and experience in the area of psychological practice for which they'll supervise, or areas of psychological practice for which they'll supervise. Every supervisor,
What page are you referring to in pathways?
it's page 7 of the one that's not all marked through and stuff, so it's the clean one. Page 7, lines 1 and 2, so it's number 4 in parentheses and lines 1 and 2 on page 7. Every supervisor of a psychological assistant shall have the education, training, and experience in the areas of psychological practice for which they will supervise, and shall be responsible for supervising the psychological functions performed by the psychological assistant, or something like that. Shall I go back?
Responsible for,
Supervise
I wouldn't look there. The last sentence that you read, shall be responsible for, it said and shall be responsible for?
Yeah, I just came back to this one. Shall be responsible for supervising the psychological functions performed by the psychological assistant. So I don't know if we need to say that, because we said every supervisor, well, you've already got it up there, but we'd have to take it out, so. Every supervisor of a psychological assistant shall have,
And shall be responsible for, right?
no, shall have,
Okay.
and take out the education, training, and experience in the areas of psychology for which they will supervise.
So just put have before the education.
It's there. It's right there. It's on
Oh,
line
shall
1.
have,
That's
okay.
right, that's right.
Got it.
For which they will supervise, and shall be responsible for supervising, performing a psychological assistant.
To the extent,
Didn't we take out consistent with the training?
Yeah,
We're getting redundant here.
yeah, I agree. So what are you saying?
So,
In the areas of psychological practice, for which,
And kind and quality of the psychological functions. Excuse me, my microphone's off. Performed by the psychological assistant. And then I think we take out the extent, kind, quality
yeah,
of the
absolutely.
psychological
Yeah.
performance.
Yeah,
Or do we?
yeah, we do, because that's what we're trying to.
Take all
but
that
not
out?
the whole thing.
No.
Wait a
Not the whole
minute.
thing.
Just after supervisors' training and experience,
Yeah, I think you stop it there, don't you?
yeah, run that out, X that out. Shall be responsible for supervising psychology performed by the psych assistant and ensure that the psychological assistant complies with the provisions of the code, the board's regulations, and the ethical standards. Okay.
Do we want to say ethical standards and guidelines established by the?
No, because guidelines are just that, and we have ethical standards, or
Right,
APA
right,
has
right,
ethical
right.
standards, but guidelines are aspirational, they're not we don't.
I was thinking
require
about this, like the guidelines that they issue periodically about working with specific
I
populations.
know,
that's
but
a-
they're,
No,
they're-
I'm just asking.
yeah, no, I don't think so, because they're guidelines, everybody doesn't do it that way. And it doesn't mean they're not practicing ethically or whatever, so.
Sure.
The other thing I think is in Part B, coming up here, the supervisor shall inform each client or patient prior to the rendering. And that's not typically what happens.
Psychological assistance that does it.
Right, it's in the informed consent, it's on the bill, it's on all kinds of stuff like that. So I don't think we want to say the supervisor shall inform each client or patient.
So each
We
client shall
have to
be
think of
informed.
some way to say this.
Just each client or patient shall be informed prior to
Each
the rendering?
client or patient, yeah, shall be informed prior to the rendering of services that the psych assistant is unlicensed and is under the direction.
This is in the section of supervisors' responsibilities. Should it be moved somewhere else then?
Correct.
Correct.
Well, it is the supervisor's responsibility to ensure that that happens.
Then maybe that's what needs to be
Yeah.
added in there. The supervisor is required to ensure.
The supervisor shall ensure that each client or patient,
That might be simpler.
yeah, that's
Okay.
better. Because it's their responsibility to ensure it, but it's
Okay.
not the supervisor who tells them.
Okay.
Typically, the way it works is that the psychological assistant has an informed consent that they've worked on with the supervisor, and
Yeah.
it says it all in the
That's
informed
right.
consent agreement. But it's the psychological assistant that makes sure that that stuff gets
That's
signed.
right.
Should be the supervisor.
Did you see what we said? No, it should be the supervisor
Yeah.
shall ensure each client.
Yeah.
So we're going back to the way it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Not exactly.
No,
exactly,
not
Fixing
exactly,
the each
but-
client part for you, okay.
Because we were in supervisor's
It's now back to
responsibility.
The supervisor.
So keep the supervisor, take out each client or patient,
instead
and
of-
say, shall ensure each client, shall ensure that each client or patient.
No,
Shall ensure
that each client.
that each,
Client or
So I don't think we leave
An
each client or
underline.
patient, and we just put that in front.
that's right. Client or patient, comma, prior to the rendering of services by the psych assistant, comma, or prior to the rendering of services.
But you gotta have
Yeah.
informed by the patient.
Wait.
Somewhere
Well,
they're gonna
yeah, hold
be,
on.
yeah, you're right.
Ensure that each client or
Yeah.
patient prior to the rendering
Okay,
of
just a second,
services
let's
by-
get this part. Prior to the rendering of services, take out by the psych assistant. Take out by the. Okay. That the psychological assistant is unlicensed under the direction,
Well, shall inform each patient or client.
shall ensure that each client or patient is informed.
Right.
Yes.
Is informed.
No,
No.
Line 62, Jason.
Sorry, Jason. We're looking in all different
Back to
parts
assistant.
here.
There,
Supervisors.
okay.
Write the top line of B. Supervisor shall ensure that each client or patient is informed. IN, yeah. Comma, prior to the rendering of
It
services,
should be underlined.
comma, that the psychological assistant is unlicensed and is under the direction and supervision of the supervisor. Period. Each client or patient shall also be informed. How about that?
At each client or patient?
Each client
Or patient.
or patient shall also, or shall be informed,
Or shall also be.
shall also be informed. Take out the and. that the supervisor shall have access to the client or patient's chart in fulfilling his or her supervisory duties. Okay. How does that read? Each client or patient is informed prior to the regular services, psychological system is unlicensed. I think you got an extra space in there between assistant and is.
What line?
But, line 63. It's like unlicensed under the direction of supervisor. Each client shall also be in front of the supervisor. Okay. That looks all right to me. Does it look all right to y'all? And those were the only suggestions I had for that.
So the only question that I would have is the next section, I guess C in particular, but I think I saw it somewhere else. Sometimes I think we corrected some of these. Some we have assistant, we don't have psychological assistant. And so I think like that C,
Yeah, you're
we
right.
should make it consistent and put psych assistant everywhere. as opposed to
Everywhere.
Just assistant.
Otherwise, it's like an assistant. And,
Well,
yeah, as
it-
opposed to a psych assistant. I mean, like, administrative assistant or something. That's not what this is. That's a good point. We should probably look everywhere to make sure it says psychological assistant anytime it says assistant.
Yeah.
So, does this look all right to y'all? Okay. You all right? Okay. I mean, all right with this?
All right, all friends.
All right, all right. And Dr. Phillips, you are too?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, we want to bring it to the board. We're going to have comments if there are any,
To move.
but are we going to need a motion to bring this to the board as we've changed it? Okay. All right, so would somebody like to make that motion?
I move that the proposed regulatory language be submitted to the board for its approval and its discussion and approval. That's incredibly
November
imprecise.
meeting.
I'll withdraw my motion and let Ms. Jones take a whack at it.
No, it sounds, I guess the only thing is the regulatory hearing, right? Is that the only other information we need?
November meeting, at the November meeting.
Second.
At the November
As
board
amended.
meeting.
Okay, so it's been moved and seconded that we bring this regulation with the recommendations we made to the full board at its November meeting for a regulatory hearing. And with this isn't part of the motion, but with this, just to remind you, either we'll have the language for this Form XXX, or we'll have what is currently there and what we're currently asking, so the board has an idea. Sorry.
And just a technicality, this language that is on pages 1 through 4 in the packets will be noticed. We will hold a hearing, separate and apart from a board meeting, and the board will review the language at the November meeting for consideration of adoption. And we will include, as you mentioned, Dr. Horn, the inclusion of the form for the board's review.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so is there any more discussion from the committee members about this regulation? Yes?
Jones.
No?
I did.
Ms. Jones did. I just called for people that did.
And you're talking about sections 1391.1 to 5, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, and 1392.1?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
That's correct. All right, so there's no more discussion from the committee. Is there any discussion from the public? Any public comment on this regulation? Seeing none, could we have call for a vote? Thanks.
Horn,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Phillips,
Aye.
passes.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're still on 6. How are we doing? Anybody need a break or anything? Okay, we're gonna take a 5-minute break. We'll be back.
Correction, Mr. Glassbeagle, thank you, just brought that to my attention. There is a preliminary review of regulatory packages that is performed by Department of Consumer Affairs and Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. This change to the process was just made on September 7th. So in light of that change, we will be submitting the paperwork, the notice, the initial statement of reasons, and the proposed language to OAL on November 22nd, which is after the board meeting. I was going back to this optimistic view in my head of pre-process change. So the notice will go to OAL on November 22nd. That notice will be closed on December 2nd, and then the hearing will take place in between the November and the February board meeting. And then the board will consider adoption of the language and the form at the February meeting. So just correction on the process. Thank you, Mr. Glassbeagle.
Thank you very much. All right, we are ready for still number 6, but now we are moving to pathways to licensure and 1387. So, I think what we want to do is look now, what I did and marked on is, I looked and marked on the stuff that wasn't all marked out and everything, but just the clean copy. So, let's take a look at 1387. The first thing I want to say is what a great job y'all did in 1387. It's just really, really excellent. I know you took a lot of stuff together and put it together. So now, looking at what you've come up with, let's take a look at this and make sure that it's clear for our folks. It doesn't conflict with anything. It doesn't highlight anything that, or, you know, we don't see anything in there, oh, we didn't consider this or whatever. Make sure that it does reflect what we want it to. So, if it's all right, can we look at the clean copy? Can we look at the clean copy? Will that mess you up?
Yeah, I can't post the clean copy on your screens, and if you want me to track make the changes,
Okay.
I should make it in the.
Yeah, you should make it there, so, okay.
I did most of my markup on the unclean
Card?
copy and then reread it in the clean copy.
Okay.
It was a long flight.
Okay, so let's go on the unclean copy. And I will adjust my markups and stuff as a result, so. Let me get mine out, just to. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to throw it open to y'all, and let's just start with this section applies to all trainees, blah, blah, blah.
I don't know. No.
In that first section, I would like to change license, toward meeting the licensing requirements on lines 4 and 5 to licensure requirements. But that's, I do that all the way through, but, and, because it sounds better to me, but I don't know if y'all have thoughts about that or anything. These are licensure requirements, right? Not licensing requirements.
Do you
Okay.
want, just do a global change?
Yeah, let's do a global change. Thank you. Let's just keep going down. The next thing I have is on line, pre-doctoral SPE. So it'll be page 2, line 1. That's the next thing I have. So what you're saying is pre-doctoral SPE, up to 1,500 hours, maybe include pre-doctorally, but only after completion of 48, blah, 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 blah. Not including thesis, correct. Internship, I would scratch that out. Your internship is your pre-doctoral SPE if you have an internship, and, or dissertation. And it doesn't count toward, so you've got psychology not including thesis, internship, or dissertation. And I would like to scratch out internship because your internship is your pre-doctoral SPE. And it can only be taken after, you can only get your internship after you complete a certain number of hours of coursework.
Was this intended to be a reference to practicum?
I'm thinking they might be talking about practicum, but I don't even think that would be a good thing to say about practicum. Practicum is part of it's the applied work you take, the hours count toward your degree. So if they were talking about practicum, I think that also should be taken out. So thesis or dissertation.
Okay.
Right,
You could never have an internship prior to this anyway, yeah.
that's right, exactly.
Okay.
Okay, the next thing I have is.
Do you want to go through all yours, Jackie, and then have us go through
Oh, okay.
ours?
That's a good way
Or
to
do you
do it.
want, because I've got some serious reservations on this page.
Okay.
So at some point I would like to express them.
Okay,
And I think they were things that weren't even necessarily, by my recollection, agreed to by the committee the last time, relative to taking out certification of internships,
okay.
both pre and postdoc. So.
Could we go by the pages? 'Cause I think it might be.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go by
Yeah.
page by
Okay, so
page.
we're looking at the marked up copy, which I have previously
Yeah.
referred to as the unclean copy. The marked up copy, page 2, lines 3 through 9. The internships no longer require any approval by any agency, apparently. And the same is true if you go further down, lines 21 to 26. The postdoctoral placements do not require, if they're an internship program, don't require approval by any of the accrediting agencies.
What we
I
did
think
was.
2911 is
2911.
what
Is it all got
specifies
moved,
that.
it all got moved to 2911?
Yeah, it
Okay.
says APIC,
It's
right?
in 2911, so this is the regulatory language, and we're referencing back to the statute here.
Okay, so the
And
statute covers that.
Statute
okay.
covers what acceptable internship programs.
Phew, because otherwise you've got Joe's Pancake Shop and internship.
I help the staff. Okay. I would have had to agree with that. Okay, still on that page?
The only other thing I would say, on line number 27, I know that we had a few, other suggestions, including one from Dr. Jolanda Crow, that I would hope that we've kept track of and that we should add to the box. I can't remember what she said, but,
Instead of psych assistant,
yeah, you remember this?
psych associate, I mean?
Registered psychologist.
No.
Someone had community something also. We had a couple of ones that we
Yeah.
had captured, so I just hope that we're gonna bring them to the stakeholders. But I know that I don't see it listed here, but I thought you had a really good one, Dr. Linda Crow. You remember this?
When we were discussing registered psychologists,
I remember having a really good idea.
Oh, it's,
You're sure she's
Always.
right about
we
that?
have it in our mocked-up version. So it's-
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
that registered
registered-
psychologist, bring term to stakeholders, psychological associate.
Yeah, we have that.
We
But
had
what
several
she
other
said,
ones.
There were several comments. I thought, or several suggestions. I thought one, I know one of the things you talked about, Dr. Linda Crow, was when we talked about sponsor-approved continuing education, and that's where I think you came up with some
No, it was
good things.
It was here.
It was
It was here.
Okay. I know community psychologist was one, but we didn't want psychologists. This is confusing. It's calling the person a psychologist and the person isn't a psychologist.
No, I know what we wanted, but in
Yeah.
terms of bringing it to the term, I just don't want us to lose the suggestions that we had. Do we say?
Yes, yes.
But thank you for adding that, reviewing it for
so,
us.
so you'll review the videotape to see what other suggestions were made, and bring those all to the stakeholders. We just don't want to include the word psychologist
So
in there.
if any of
because
them
it's an
are
impression of a
psychologists, don't include those for the stakeholders, because that's what we're saying. We do not want people to be called psychologists who aren't.
license. Right.
Okay.
Well, I think we should put all the suggestions that were on the table out there and have the stakeholders look at it personally, because even this one says registered psychologist. We don't like that term, but I don't think we've gotten the full feedback. So I know kind of our own personal,
Okay.
whatever.
Right, okay.
I think it's important that we
That's
keep
fine.
the conversation.
Let the stakeholders know everything that was there. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so that's all on that page for me. Next page. The 10% supervision, is that here? Yeah, I've got that lines 27 through 32.
I don't feel like, and this is looking at page 3, lines 27 through 32, I don't think we've resolved this whole question of how to express the formula, because it says 10% of SPE shall be in direct supervision, which could be read as, for every 40 hours of that you're reporting SPE, 36 hours of it should be in whatever your service you're providing, and 4 hours should be in supervision. The way we've interpreted it previously, which is 10% above the 100%, so it's really 110%. So I don't think this, and I don't blame this on the staff, but we have never clarified this language.
This wasn't.
And I think it does baffle people. I was at a continuing education workshop on supervision this weekend as just a participant sitting there, and brought this up as one of the things. Also brought up what we had discussed at a prior meeting regarding the fact that if there were 13 hours of face-to-face, if they only needed to do 1.3 hours of supervision, and people were gobsmacked because a lot of them were doing 2 hours of supervision. So I do think that we need to clarify this language. I don't know if we delegated it to staff or we just kind of kicked the ball down the field and.
Well, I agree with
think we were
you.
gonna
I
go to
think it's
stakeholders.
still unclear. And I think that what we want to do is I think we have to decide, which do we want? Do we want to say it's part of the, say, 100%? Or do we say it's over and above? It's 10%, but it's over and above the 100%. That is an issue to be clarified, and then I think this would make more sense. So what are we saying? If you work 40 hours, say, then you have to have 4 hours of supervision, and that has to be 4 hours on top of the 40 hours that you're getting SPE for? Is that what we're saying? Because that's how we've been interpreting it.
From what I recollect, I think we said that's why we have the note to bring to stakeholders, that it would be calculated that way. It would be the 4 above and beyond. I think that's where I remember us talking last committee meeting.
Then, if that's the decision we made, then the language needs to reflect that, and it doesn't. So I think
Yeah.
we need to put,
Yeah.
like, over and above, that 10% is over and above the number of hours worked.
10% of services, 10% in addition
To the-
services delivered.
In addition to the SPE, yeah.
So, because I think we heard, if I recall correctly, from CDCR, that one of the concerns was that people got 44 hours there. One of the attractions to the job was you could get 44 hours a week
Right.
as opposed to 40, and that would allow people to get licensed more quickly, which allows them to repay the
Right.
very substantial student loans that psych grad students are accruing these
Right.
days. So I'm all for the 44 hours remaining intact, just the clarity of the language.
So, but then that sounds like they are counting those 4 hours as an additional 4 hours of SPE.
Mhm.
Well, that's what I'm suggesting, that for every 10 hours of supervised professional experience, there should be 1 hour of supervision.
That's what we're saying.
11.
But that's
But
not
that's
how
not
this.
what it says here.
Right.
And that's not what they're doing at CDCR. They are counting 44 hours of SPE, and that's why people are getting licensed sooner.
Well, I'm good with that part of it. In other words, somebody could deliver 40 hours of direct service and then get 4 hours of supervision on top of that, satisfy the supervision requirement, have a total of 44 hours for the week.
And that counts, all 44 hours count toward SPE.
That's personally,
That's fine. I mean, I don't care. That's fine.
but I don't
We
think
do
that's
count
what
on
this
two.
says.
Yeah, I don't either.
Well, and the other thing that we said too, I think in that conversation, a minimum of 10%. So could people do 20%?
Sure. You can always do more.
But then it's the number of hours to, what's the cap for the week, right? That was
Capping
the,
it at 44.
I still think they can only get 4 hours of supervision credit.
so I think that was part of the conversation, but then it's a cap of 44 hours.
yeah.
Because that was part of the conversation,
That's
right?
right.
Because then it could be, I think someone said it can be 60 hours or whatever it was, right? I feel
Right.
like that was part of the
Well, the
conversation.
reality is, I think in some of the APA pre-doc internships, people are at their site substantially longer than 40 hours a week, or 44 hours a week. There's, some of them are there for every day of the week. So, yeah, but I think we just want to count 44, so
We're
that we
going to
know
only
that
count 44.
people's got at least 35 weeks out in the field
Up 10%.
before they sit down for that final examination. And
So
they
we
put
want
in-
to say a minimum of 10% of SPE should be in direct supervision. That's not how we want to say it. What we want to say is that for every 10, how do we want to say this? 10% of the time spent in,
Direct psychological service, except there's more things than that
that's
actually
right,
count toward
that's
that.
right.
Uh,
Because there's a lot of training that goes on, it's not just all direct service. But we want to say essentially we want to say for every 10 hours worked, there needs to be an hour of, at least 1 hour of direct supervision, and that's
A
over and
minimum of
above the 10
10%.
hours. That's what we want to say.
Right.
And there's a maximum of 44 hours a week that can be counted toward SPE.
Correct.
So, how do we say that?
So, not that I have the words, but like, almost like saying, for every 10 hours, there has to be 1 hour equaling 11 hours
Right.
for a
If
maximum.
I was writing it like a textbook, that's what I would say. I would say, for example, if you spent 10 hours
Right.
seeing patients that week, you would get an additional 1 hour. But
For a
we
total of
can't,
11.
we can't write regulations like that,
No.
unfortunately.
But that's
But
the
we can
concept.
definitely let staff know, and that's how y'all been doing it anyway. But that's, I think we need to,
I just don't think licensees
No, it's
who are
not clear.
supervisors and
Uh-uh.
people that are accruing time, no.
so this might be one of the things when we're sending our thing to supervisors and to licensees, just educationally we want to say. But this is, we still don't want to word it this way.
Because that's not really what this language says.
That's not what this language says.
Well, is it something like trainings shall be provided 1 hour supervision for each 10 hours of service or something like that?
1 additional hour of supervision for each 10 hours. It's not all service.
I mean, but, yeah, but I was thinking whatever.
Yeah,
And you can't really use the word supervised professional experience because the hours
that's
of
part of it.
supervision is
yeah.
part of the supervised professional
Right.
experience. Oh, I hate shit like this.
Can I,
I don't-
maybe now make a suggestion?
If you have recommendations, help us.
Yep, I'm with you on that. So where you're going 1 additional hour, so 1 additional hour of direct supervision shall be provided.
And that doesn't capture that exactly either, because if somebody's doing 13 hours of direct service, they only really need to get, as is currently being interpreted by our licensing division, 1.3 hours of supervision, as opposed to 2 hours of supervision. So it's not like you hit mark 11 and then you go into 2 hours.
I don't know if it helps. However, if I'm saying 1 additional hour of direct supervision shall be provided for each 10-hour increment of direct services, you just wait till you hit that next 10-hour increment of direct services until you do that next hour of supervision.
No.
Does that help?
Yeah, you wouldn't want somebody doing 19 hours of
And only getting
direct
one.
contact
And
and
getting
have
1
1
hour.
hour of supervision.
Until they hit that next hour, and then they have to accrue that next hour of supervision.
Yeah, because you really wouldn't have enough time to discuss
Okay.
the
So
work.
that's the concern.
What about for every 10 hours of supervised professional experience, there must be 1 additional hour of direct supervision?
Okay, and I now have 15 hours, so what do I do?
That's,
So it's almost like going back to for 1 hour, you need 1 hour service, and you hit 10, it's the second hour, right?
Right. I mean, that's the easiest way to think about it.
Yeah, and
But
that's
it-
the way most people actually do it.
okay, so, sorry, and I know this is totally free-flowing, I apologize. But 1 additional hour and a proportional increment thereof shall be provided
The time of each week.
for every 10 hours. So like it's a proportional increment over 10 hours, and it's a proportional increment of over 1 hour. That, so for every 1 additional hour, comma, and a proportional increment thereof.
Or each additional hour of
It's like a
non-supervised
proportional
SPE.
increment by the fraction essentially. So like 1 additional hour
Or proportional
or
increment of
proportional
anything
increment
between the next
thereof
hour.
shall
So the
be
next
provided
hour.
for every 10-hour increment. So if it's over the 10, the increment above the 10 is how much more you add to that additional supervision.
But even if somebody was doing, but we'd also have to capture the idea that even if somebody was only seeing 3 hours, they were only doing 3 hours of service, they're still entitled to the first hour of supervision.
They get, it's not like 3.
They don't get 0.3 hours of
They
supervision for
still
seeing
have to have the
3.
1 hour face-to-face,
Huh?
no matter how much they work.
Yeah, they always get 1 hour face-to-face with their primary supervisor, right?
But we're not saying face-to-face anymore, we're just saying,
Oh.
or direct.
Direct.
We are actually
Yeah.
saying individual supervision with the primary supervisor.
Yeah, individual, yeah.
So minimum 10% of SPE shall be indirect supervision, is that what we mean? That very first sentence, a minimum of 10% of SPE shall be in direct supervision. Are we saying that? Or a minimum of 10% of SPE shall be supervised or shall, be supervised, or, it's not 10% of the SPE indirect supervision, it's 10% of the SPE.
But SPE stands for supervised professional experience, so you know the experience is supervised, it's just,
Right.
what's the proportion of that supervision that's direct?
We've taken that out, I'm saying. We're not saying individual, face-to-face direct, we're just saying individual supervision, right?
No.
10% has to be
1 hour
in
per
individual
week Shall
supervision,
be
that's what we're
individual,
saying.
it's right there.
And with your, isn't that what we're saying?
When, I don't know when that was
y'all took it out here, shall be face-to-face, direct.
I think we took it out because we said that supervision didn't have to be necessarily face-to-face.
That's right.
It could be in a different
That's right.
modality.
Right.
But I think though, back to your question, you said, are we saying 10%? No,
Yeah.
we're not always saying 10%.
That's right.
Because if we're saying 13 hours, we're not saying 1.3 hours, we're saying 2 hours, right?
No, that's what people are doing, but the way it's,
Well,
oh, yeah, yeah.
But really, they can comply with this literal language
By
by
doing
doing
0.3.
1.3. But with this formula, if you read that first sentence, a minimum of 10% of SGPE shall be in direct supervision. If you're going to get your maximum of 44 hours, it would have to be 39.6 hours of,
Because it says shall be indirect, so it's 10% of the SPE, so that's exactly right. If you get 44 hours, what that means is,
you get 4.4 hours of supervision.
you get 4.4 hours of supervision. It's not doing like what we want it to do. I think we want to say there has to be at least 1 hour of direct supervision
We say that.
a week. Or
That's a-
1 hour, just period, regardless of how many hours.
Yeah.
Every
What'd you say
week
on
the
line
person
30?
has to
Yeah.
get- Wait a minute. Yeah, I know that, but what I'm thinking of the whole thing we want to say. So I think we want to say 1 hour a week has to be with the primary supervisor, okay?
No matter how much time they're putting in.
No matter how much time they're putting in.
Right.
But then we want to say, direct supervision, or supervision, individual supervision. Do we want to say individual supervision? No, this is just supervision, period. Any kind of supervision at this point in time. 1 hour a week has to be individual. But if there's more than 1 hour a week, depending on how many hours somebody works, it can be group supervision or any kind of thing like that, right? Okay, so we want to say 1 hour has to be with the primary supervisor every week, regardless of the number of hours. But in general, I mean, you know, over and above that, for the total amount of time worked, there needs to be a cumulative total of, like, above the actual SPE itself of the supervision time.
So we're saying for all supervised professional experience except supervision, there would need to be a 10% increment of supervision above and beyond that. But
I mean,
I don't know how to say that eloquently.
Yeah, I don't either.
so let me ask you a question, because I know that part of the reason also we got to 44 was about the notion that we wanted people not to work more than 40 hours, right? That was like, we didn't want to,
Right.
because that was, we had someone here that was from, was it Kaiser, that was talking about how they schedule people, which is part of the reason I think it was to bring the stakeholders, because asking them how they do their programs. So if we're saying that basically if people are working a max of 40 hours a week, so then we're saying a minimum, not minimum necessarily, but a minimum of 4 hours can be for supervision at a 40-hour week, right?
We say we require 4 hours.
We require
Yeah.
4 hours a
Mhm.
week if you're
For
working
sure, you
40
can do
hours.
more if you're working 40 hours, yeah.
Right, but you can always do more direct supervision if needed.
But we're only gonna count up to there.
So we're saying that we're only gonna count 10%, or we say a minimum of 10%. But the accrual amount is only 10%. We won't accept more than 10% for direct supervision, right?
If it's a 40-hour week. No, we're not saying we won't accept more than that, but we're saying if it's a 40-hour week that somebody's working, the maximum we're gonna count toward their qualifying experience is 44 hours. So we're gonna count those 4 hours required, but no more.
So the way this is written currently, probably hours in direct supervision with a maximum of 44 hours. Direct supervision wouldn't be only 4 hours. It wouldn't be 44 then, right? because that's SBE
Yeah, but
plus.
this is total hours a week accrued toward SPE. Maybe you're right. Maybe we
But I'm
shouldn't
saying-
confuse the two and just say, here's how much we'll.
Because the way this
accept a
reads to
year.
me, it starts off hours of direct
Oh,
supervision, right?
Mhm.
And then with max, so I think there's two separate things.
So maybe
So
the
maybe
question,
describe one and then describe the other.
yeah, I was just gonna ask the committee what would you want to count towards SPE? And does it need to be direct or just supervised professional experience? Because the way that this current language reads is that someone can get up to 44 hours per week of SPE counted towards their requirements for licensure, and anything that was not in direct supervision would not count towards SPE. That's the way I'm reading it, unless I'm not reading it right.
I would agree with you, Ms. Ork, although that sentence in line 28 seems to define direct supervision slightly different. Right?
Right, so what we're saying is you have to have this amount of supervision,
Of direct supervision.
and if you have up to 44 hours of direct supervision, you can count all of that towards your SPE. Anything above and beyond the 10%, you can get up to 44 hours,
Oh, it's a
as
different-
long as it's directly supervised. That's how I'm reading it, unless I'm not reading it right. So that's a policy call for the
Yeah.
committee is how much direct supervision do you want to require
Okay, yeah.
or accept?
Well, no, it sounds like different to me, like SPE and then direct
Oh.
supervision. The way it's written, it's written in a confusing way, right?
Yeah.
Because we're saying SPE, 44 hours, direct supervision, a
10%.
minimum of 10% of SPE.
Yeah,
And then no more than 44.
Well, no more than 44 with everything combined is what I'm hearing, is both the SPE plus direct supervision, not just direct supervision.
Right.
That is correct.
So maybe what we should say is the maximum number of hours, I'm thinking out loud, but the maximum number of hours that can be provided in supervised professional experience other than supervision would be 40 hours. And for each, and then say for 10% of the time spent in that unsupervised, it's not unsupervised, but the non-supervision
Yeah.
hours would have to correspond to the amount of supervision that they're given. And the maximum total would be 44 hours. Is that
They
right?
have to have, yeah. You can't have more than, I mean,
You can't,
can
toward
have
accrual,
more
it-
supervision, but
To
we're
accrue
gonna
toward your
only count toward
license.
accrual toward
People do all
licensure.
sorts of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Because people get a lot more than an hour a week of supervision,
So,
typically.
question in terms of staff and how we track this, is there a category for SPE and then direct supervision? Or are we just looking at the total number for the week?
we're just looking at the total number, and it's the supervisor that documents that to us. If there's any discrepancy or anything, we'll ask for the weekly logs, which will give us a weekly breakdown of what they did each week, how much supervision that they got.
So back to what you said, Dr. Phillips, then it actually, it's just the total is 44
total.
hours a week. Because it could be 8 hours in direct supervision, actually, right? And it could be, as long as they had 4 of those hours as direct supervision, it's good. But they could actually have 10 hours of
There's
direct
some
supervision
sites
and
that
30.
do
Oh, I
quite
see
a
what
bit
you're saying.
more
So
than,
it could be
8.
somebody you got 10 hours of direct you got 10 hours of supervision. And you had 34 hours of actual service delivery or whatever it is. And that would still add up to the 44. Oh, well, so much for my idea. It is a big word problem.
what we do, is when we get a verification of experience form, we ask for the total number of hours that person worked that week. So if they put 40 and they put 4 hours, we only count 40. We don't add that 4 hours. We don't assume that that person was there 44 hours, because we ask for the total number of hours they work. We do get a lot of forms that say 44. And then and we do they need to say how many hours were in supervision.
See,
But
and
I
that's
don't add
because
it, I
people
don't
are
plus it.
interpreting this two different ways.
Yeah.
it's confusing,
Mhm.
you know, the way it's listed.
So
So thanks
let's-
for telling us.
Let's say you got a form that said that they had 12 hours of all these different activities other than supervision. Would you then look to see that they had 1.2 hours of
Mhm.
supervision?
Yes, I
At least
would.
1.2 hours of
Yes.
supervision? Okay, so you're still checking the proportions against each other?
Yes.
Okay.
Just how to say that.
Well, it sounds like that there, I mean, just talking out loud here, that it would be important to keep that 44
Mhm.
and,
10%.
but to somehow say with a maximum of 44 hours, that includes supervision and SPE, like to describe what the maximum could include. And, because that means a lot of people aren't getting full credit. As other, not,
That's right, they're interpreting it differently,
yeah.
and so if they're putting
It
44
says including
hours,
supervision.
then do you require an addition, if they say 44 hours of SPE, then do you look for 4 hours of,
Just the 4 hours.
Supervision?
Because we're assuming that they got the 40 and then the 4 hours are on top of that for
but
the.
that's an assumption you
That's
make.
another assumption,
And
yeah.
if people put 40 and
4, we don't,
you
yeah,
don't-
we don't assume that they're,
exactly,
we're
you don't
44.
count it. So this is, it's confusing.
It is.
People are sending it in a confusing way.
But what we do is we don't take hours away. We look, they have to write down how many hours that person worked for that total period of time. So if they say 1,548 hours, you know, that's the number we take. So they're giving us the total. So we're not minusing hours
No,
out.
I
Yeah.
understand, but they may not be getting the full credit.
The supervisor might not
But-
be,
but-
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we want to be really clear about what
Mm-hmm.
gets counted and what doesn't, you know. I don't think we ought to have a maximum of 44 hours because I think that's confusing. I think we ought to say, you know, this is a max, that you can work a maximum of 40 hours a week for those, which would require you to have 4 hours of direct supervision. Those addition, you know, over and above the 4 hours, then the 40 hours a week, then those do count toward your total SPE.
But wouldn't they also require additional supervision?
Huh?
Wouldn't they require additional supervision as well?
No, that's what I'm saying. If we say this is a maximum, you can only work a 40-hour week, that will count toward supervision. I mean, count,
Toward
Toward
non-supervised
S-
SP, or non-supervised.
toward
SPE
your
other than supervision,
experience.
other than-
Yeah. You need
Duties.
to add to that,
The 10%.
including your 4 hours of supervision. Let me see.
Is anyone opposed to using indirect at all? Because we could say that a maximum of 40 hours total per week and indirect supervised services can accrue towards SPE, and a maximum of 4 hours of supervised or direct supervision can accrue towards, so that like you're getting the two different things.
I think we're confusing in this, not the supervision, direct or indirect, but I think what we're confusing here is SPE and supervision for SPE. And they're confused in this one thing.
And that's why I was trying to make an indirect versus direct, and it all counts towards SPE.
But
That's
I-
not the,
Yeah, and I think
that's
from the,
not the confusion.
from the point of view of licensees and psych assistants and other folks, indirect doesn't sound like service delivery.
Okay.
So, it's a nice thought, though.
Sorry, I was just trying to
Yeah.
find a tweener for you.
Yeah, no,
No,
I hear you.
thanks.
I hear you.
I just don't think that's the, I think maybe we ought to have two parts here, because when we count it when we call it SPE, and of course supervision is included in that SPE experience. As part of your supervised professional experience is the time you spend in supervision. You're learning things there.
When I've
So-
looked at the weekly logs, that always includes the supervision in their totals. You know, they have a line supervision, direct supervision, and they have it all broken down, all the different duties, and they've always included that in their total.
Okay.
in the ones I've seen.
So I
So
wonder,
how do we state it so that,
is it the
clear.
language that was stricken on 35 and 36?
well, there you go, 35 and 36. A maximum of 44 hours per week will be credited toward meeting the SPE requirement. This shall include the required 10% supervision. I think that's what we're saying.
We struck it out.
So if we could take that out of there and just say, let's see.
But what caused us to strike that, to say that it wasn't clear enough and that people were calculating it incorrectly? Because I feel like that was part of our effort to combine that section and the section below 35 through 38, right? Can you scroll down slightly, Jason?
Yes.
So we can see this last part.
I think the distinction might have been that those hours that were accrued that did not involve direct supervision would not count towards their SPE. I think that was the distinction that was made in the more current language. Because the way the prior language read with the maximum of 44 hours per week will be credited towards meeting the SPE requirement, that only required the 10% supervision, but didn't really speak to how much of that was direct and then how much they could count towards SPE at the end.
I'm sorry, I don't understand, because if 27 was still there too, we start off by saying they will be, the supervision is 10% of the total time, and then that maximum, so.
If we had those two together, training shall be provided with supervision for 10% of the total time worked each week. A maximum of 44 hours per week will be credited toward meeting the requirement, and this shall include the required 10%. That's one part. And then we could say, at least 1 hour per week of the supervision, of the 10% required supervision, shall be individual supervision with the primary supervisor.
Do you want to say direct supervision with the primary supervisor?
See, all right, that came up as the issue too, is that the supervision may not be the primary supervisor all the time. That was also the question,
Right.
comment that we got.
An hour from the primary supervisor to the other people.
Right.
Which is actually part of the original.
Absolutely, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, at least 1 hour a week shall be, do we want to, I think we can just say individual supervision with the primary supervisor, because a lot of times it's other people that are observing directly and stuff.
Sometimes it's case consultation.
Yeah, different kinds of things. So that, if we keep training shall be provided with supervision for 10% of the total time worked each week, and then lines 35 and 36 keep in as well and come right after that.
Okay.
Just move the, copy and paste the language into 4 or 3.
3, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so now, okay,
Let's just copy.
so.
Right there.
Here. And it's going to be new language. No, it's new because it's making it different. It's just be unstruck and then this is being unstruck.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then if we went down.
Period here.
Yeah. And then if we went down, and let me just, so do we want to say,
I like one additional
okay, so
hour.
now we've said 44 hours a week will be credited, and that includes the 10% supervision.
Mhm.
Then do we want to say right there, a minimum of 10% of the SPE shall? Yeah, let's take that out now. No, wait.
Yeah, just to the end of the first
Yeah.
sentence.
Yeah,
For-
take that
After
out.
the 10%, yeah, okay.
Now, are we saying, let's take out that other stuff that y'all put in there when we were just talking and you're trying to follow us? The next underlined
Remind me where
stuff?
that is.
Huh?
Where your
Remind me
cursor
that
is.
was.
It's right, it's coming
Right.
next, all the next underlined.
Okay. This stuff right here?
Yeah, take that out. At least 1 hour per week of this supervision shall be individual supervision with the primary supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
And then take out, we've already said a maximum up there, so take out the next sentence. And then leave in the last one. No,
Sorry.
there you go.
But it doesn't say anything about direct supervision now.
Well, hold
Do you
on,
want that,
hold
or-
on, let's see. The supervision, maximum 44 hours creditory meeting, showing crew, the required at least 1 hour per week of the supervision shall be individual supervision with the primary supervisor. Okay, so we do want to say, how much have we said that 1 hour, it has to be direct supervision? In other words, you have to actually see the person working.
Well, yeah, the 1 hour direct face to
Or hear
face.
them on videotape
Yeah.
is typically what happens, or audio tape or whatever. Direct supervision. You actually have to see what they do,
Mhm.
not just have them report on it.
Mhm.
To be credited.
Is that hour in addition to the individual supervision with the primary supervisor, we're already saying?
Yes, so,
So you'd have
because
two-
it
2
could be the
hours?
primary supervisor that does direct supervision,
Okay.
but we want to say that one of the 10% hours has to be in direct supervision.
With the primary supervisor.
So maybe 10% of the total time worked each week, comma, 1 hour of which is in direct supervision.
Isn't that the supervision with the primary supervisor?
That's
Huh?
what I just asked and they said no.
So isn't that 1 hour a week direct supervision with your primary supervisor?
Well, it may or may not be.
It's always,
I mean, I'm trying to,
It's always been, we've always required the primary supervisor to always do at least 1 hour of supervision.
mhm.
Otherwise, you've got primary supervisor signing up on hours that we never set with the permission,
Mhm.
saying that they're doing competent work.
so you want it to be direct supervision by the primary supervisor?
Mhm.
Okay, then thanks, Ruth. So let's say that,
So we can
take
remove,
that part out,
Yep.
and that last part we just added, and this shall, at least 1 hour per week of this supervision shall be direct, comma, individual supervision with the primary supervisor.
So let me ask this question, because this is again supervision requirement section. In the section before this online, I don't know what it is now, but 24, we kind of say primary or delegated supervisors. I think that we were saying earlier, a second ago, that only one of those hours had to be the primary. But are we saying that, so when it gets back to like 9:27, 28, is it trainees shall be provided with supervision by the primary or delegated supervisor for 10% of the time, with one of those hours being the primary supervisor?
Yeah.
Yes,
That's what we're saying.
yes.
So I think that's direct individual supervision is probably not the right way to describe it, because
Right.
that's a different way, just different, you're adding a new
Yeah.
term. So, did you get what I said, Mr. Glassbeagle?
I heard you, I just don't.
we don't know where you're
Don't know
putting it
That's what I
at.
said either.
But you said it very well.
Heard it. I don't know if it was language or ideas though.
And were you trying to say that maybe we need to move that sentence at least 1 hour needs to go up towards the top? Is that what you're saying?
No, I was
Okay.
just saying that the section before that talks about primary or delegated supervisor. So if we're saying
Gotcha.
that 10% supervision is either with the primary supervisor or delegated supervisor, with 1 hour having to be with the primary supervisor.
Isn't that 1 hour the at least?
Exactly, but it said individual direct supervision, doesn't make sense. It needs to
Oh.
say the
Right.
primary supervisor. I'm just saying about the flow and the thought, because I know that we were saying it could be the delegated supervisor for the other 3 hours if you did a maximum of 4 hours a week.
At least 1 hour per week of the supervision shall be what? Direct.
Shall,
What are you saying?
okay,
Yeah,
so
take
were
out-
you trying to clarify that the first sentence applies to the delegated and the primary supervisor?
Yes, I'm asking
Okay.
a question, yes, because that
So,
was the question.
trainees shall be provided with supervision, you could have by the delegated or primary supervisor for 10% of the total time worked each week. And then in that other sentence, that's the third sentence, that would clarify that at least one of those hours per week must be direct individual with the primary. Is that, would that help, that the
That
two
would help,
sentences are
yes.
separate? So that the first sentence would read, trainees shall be provided with supervision for 10% of the total time worked each week with their primary or delegated supervisor.
So hold on just 1 second, because, I mean, it's fine to put that in there, but depending on the the type of SPE that's being gotten, there may or may not be a delegated supervisor.
So you have the or, and it should actually be plural supervisors. On that line 28.
But you wouldn't have more than one primary supervisor.
But they could be any of the supervisors. Yeah.
Those are the 3 types.
So it's primary, delegated, or co-supervisor, right?
Say closed?
Yeah, but we have specific
Oh,
meanings.
supervisor.
Co-supervisor. I heard closed and I'm like co-sessioned or closed or?
It's very quiet.
Postdocs or pre-doctoral interns.
Should be co-hyphen supervisor or
Say that again? See, right now, we're talking about all SPE. We're not dividing it into psych assistant, internship, postdoc. So we're talking about all.
Co-supervisor with.
A co-supervisor would take place if it's non-mental health services, supervision and non-mental health services. That's the only exception.
I have a question about the 10%, because right now, we're only requiring the 1 hour, but do we want to say the 10% needs to be in direct supervision? I feel like we've lost direct supervision a little bit, but maybe that's a policy call, I don't know.
I don't think so, because direct supervision means you're watching you are actually watching, or you have some real way of seeing the work of the person.
Maybe
And I-
process notes, it may be a videotape, it may
Right.
be an audio tape.
Right.
But somehow you're seeing, they're demonstrating to you how they're working in the room.
Right.
So the 10% doesn't need to be direct, is what you're saying?
No, 10% doesn't need to be direct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we weren't missing out on
Right.
something.
But some portion needs to be direct.
Okay, I'm confused now. I thought we were saying 10% had to be direct.
We
Right.
did initially.
There's
But now
group supervision.
So then,
There are a lot of different, when we're talking about individual supervision, that's easy, that's easy to be direct. But a lot of supervision occurs in groups where people do like case consultations, they talk about what they do, they talk about issues, and stuff like this.
We do accept
Where
that,
you're
yeah.
not actually directly by videotape or audio tape or process notes or anything like that, you're not actually directly supervising the work, you're only hearing about the work. Does that make sense?
So you would be encapsulating what's going on with the client, basically what you've been trying with the client, but you wouldn't be talking at the level of detail you would with direct supervision. You'd get solicited feedback from the group or from the supervisor of the group or from the
Which you're only requiring
at least 1 hour in the direct.
Well,
the
right, 1 hour direct supervision.
1 hour direct
And it has to be
supervision.
with the individual primary supervisor, correct?
Yes.
Yes, that's the way it's written now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 1 hour direct with the primary supervisor. And then there needs to be, assuming, let's say they're working.
But it could be a delegated or co-supervisor depending on who, could be a delegated supervisor, right?
Not providing the 1 hour direct supervision. We've always required that be done by the primary supervisor. Because the primary supervisor is responsible.
Okay, but then the
And they should
direct
be-
supervision, okay. All right. If we've always required that, then I'm not going to change it.
So I'm clear, we're saying each week, at least 1 hour has to be spent with with the primary supervisor. However, if they're working a 40-hour week, the 3 other hours have to be, what are we saying that has to be? Or
It
we're
could be
s-
supervised by the primary
It
supervisor.
could be,
Mhm.
yeah.
Or they could be supervised by a delegated supervisor.
It could be
Or
group
they could be
supervision.
Supervised by, what do they call it?
Im-
Supervisor, or it could be, yeah.
Another licensed mental health.
So we're saying that,
professional.
so then going back to, so it's 4 hours of supervision, one of which has to be the primary person.
Yeah.
But that means that then the other 3 hours would be these other categories of people.
Can be.
Can be, doesn't have to be.
Minimum of 1, up to the.
Maximum
total
of 4 to be counted for that week. So that makes sense, but that's still direct supervision. Is it not?
1 hour a week, we're saying has to be direct.
But we're saying the other 3 have to be direct supervision by either these delegated or co-supervisors if it's not the primary.
No, there's-
No,
Just supervised?
Yeah, it's confusing.
It is.
Imagine yourself in an internship site, you go see your primary supervisor for 1 hour, and you will, in some way or another, demonstrate to them specifically how you're working in the room with a patient that week, or a couple of patients that week. You might do outtakes from a videotape or audio tape or something like that. You could also go, the clinics that I work with, I'm usually a delegated supervisor outside the clinic. They will come to my office, we'll discuss cases. We may discuss a group of cases, we may do a direct supervision hour. It just depends on the particular need that week, but it doesn't have to be direct supervision of a particular case. And then they might have a case conference, they may have a couple of other delegated supervisors, so they may be getting supervision from a variety of different people in a variety of different ways. So a case conference, you go, and you might listen to somebody else present part of their case, and you're giving them feedback on the case, and that's part of the supervisory experience.
So let me ask you a question, let me stop you there for 1 second now. Because the direct supervision in this case, because I thought the way we were saying this before was that there would be 4 hours dedicated to someone giving you feedback on your work. And the way you just described it, one of those hours could be me going to hear somebody else's work be evaluated.
Well, it would be evaluated, and you would actively be involved in the process of discussing the case.
Got
So
it, no,
that's-
but
yeah.
I'm just saying, that's different than what we were talking about before in
So it's
terms
not
of
direct, it's not
supporting.
direct.
it's not
No.
direct.
But it sounded like we wanted to ensure that folks were giving dedicated time, at least an hour per 10 hours for all of their work. If we don't do it that way, then we're losing some of that supervision of their work, right?
So, but what we are saying is an hour a week has to be direct.
Mhm.
That's one of the things we want to say. So that means, if they're working, 40 hours a week and they're going to get 4 hours of supervision, only one of those has to be direct. But if they're working 10 hours a week, one of those hours, their 1 hour a week has to be direct. That's what we're saying.
No, I got it.
But all the supervision does.
I think I understand Ms. Jones' concern, which is they're not getting direct supervision on all the cases that they're working on because part of the time is being spent talking about other people's cases.
Because when the scenario initially, we were saying if it's 13 hours, they're only getting 1.3, they should actually get 2. Well, if that's the case, if it's 2 for them, it's not 2 for them, it could be it's only a minimum, or the requirement's only 1 hour for them. Because we were saying that should be more, it shouldn't just be 1 hour, and you shouldn't wait till you hit 20 to get 2 hours. So to me, it seems like that's a little
Yeah.
bit of a dilution
Yeah, I
of
see
the
what you're
purpose
saying.
of this to support them. But I get it, if that's what we want, but it just feels like it's a different conversation than we were having before in
Yeah.
my mind.
Ms. Johnson, typically when you get supervision hours reported to you, do they break it down into time spent with the primary supervisor, delegated supervisors, or
No.
in case conferences, or it just says supervision?
And just supervision.
Okay. Yeah, but we do know that, I think typically the way people interpret it is always you have to see your direct primary supervisor once a week for 1 hour of supervision, and then you need a proportionate number of hours. Some people are getting, I mean, the clinics I work with, they have a delegated supervisor for every 10 hours that they work, so they actually they'll have one primary supervisor, they'll have 3 delegated supervisors, and they have case conference, so they're getting more than, so they're talking about their cases for us, but I understand what you're saying. They could end up in a case conference where they're not talking about their cases.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I guess
Well,
what I
no,
would
no.
say, I'm sorry, Dr. Horn, I would just say that one of the things we did delete here is one of the sentences we deleted was the connote to bring the stakeholders, and I feel like maybe that's where we are, because that was the other issue too with the Kaiser person, I think they were from Kaiser, in getting a sense of what we are seeing from stakeholders, because maybe we've defined it as far as we can go on this one, and that we need to ask those particular questions about what that looks like, because if we don't currently track how the direct supervision is happening, that might help us, but I don't know. I'm sorry, Dr. Horn.
There's no doubt we want to bring this to the stakeholders because we want to see, but I think we want to have something clear for them. And so, but we definitely want to see, what they're doing. We want to make sure that whatever we have here is clear. But I'm thinking that if we said at least 1 hour per week of the supervision shall be individual supervision with the primary supervisor, or do we want to?
That's what's just down here at lines 30, 31, 32, right?
Right, yeah, lines 31 and 32. And then we want to have some way to talk about direct supervision. So do we want the supervision that comes from the primary supervisor to be direct? If so, then we can say at least 1 hour a week shall be direct individual supervision with the primary
Primary
supervisor,
supervisor.
just like we've said it here.
Or do we want to say 1 hour a week should be supervision with the primary supervisor, and at least 1 hour a week should be direct supervision of a
That's
case?
a better way to say it.
That'd be
Yeah.
2 different,
Okay.
yeah.
At least 1 hour a week shall be with the primary supervisor, individual supervision with the primary
Okay,
supervisor.
you have that.
And at least 1 hour a week? Shall be direct supervision, indirect supervision.
That sounds good. Just to add one more thought to the process here. If you go up to line 11, I'll let you finish, Mr. Glass-Steagall.
Yeah. Direct supervision. And it shall be indirect supervision, and so then scratch out of this supervision shall be direct, blah, 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 blah. All that scratched out.
Just this part, or
Keep going,
the
because we've
period.
already
I
said,
have to strike it?
yeah. Yeah. Now that looks more like what that's clear.
Well, let me add something to the equation here. If you go to line 11, we basically say that if the primary supervisor is unlicensed, then they should have a co-supervisor. Are we saying that it should be 1 hour a week with either the primary supervisor or co-supervisor? Because if that primary supervisor is not a licensed psychologist, are we saying we want at least 1 hour with a licensed psychologist?
Good point. Yes. Good point. I think we do. That's what we're saying. We want a psychologist that's socialization into the field and all that kind of stuff.
I'm trying to think when I had co-supervisors, but I think they were mostly in practical. So I don't know how much, I'm not sure how much in internships they're actually using
They
co-supervisors.
don't at all, but this is talking about all supervision, so we have to include all supervision. This isn't just about
That's 2
internship.
hours, that's what I'm clarifying.
So we could say depending on the setting or, however you want to say it. Supervision with the primary or co-supervisor. Individual supervision with the primary or co-supervisor. Line 31.
Primary right here, primary or co?
Yeah.
Supervisors,
And if you put a comma there, it just makes it easier for me.
space after code.
And at least 1 hour per week shall be in direct supervision.
Does that look right, Dr. Horn, with code dash space?
No, you don't have space.
Okay.
And I actually think we
And I-
would want to add supervisor after primary.
I like that.
Can I make a clarifying question here? We have at least 1 hour per week shall be individual supervision with the primary supervisor or co-supervisor, and at least 1 hour per week shall be in direct supervision.
Yeah.
Does that mean you must have 2 hours per week, and therefore everyone must work at least 20 hours?
Or you could you could be seeing, you could be a psych assistant, you could be seeing, it's just starting out, you've got 4 patients, you have 4 patient hours. We're now requiring them to have 2 hours of supervision on top of that.
No, I don't read it that way, but I see what you're saying. It could be confusing. We could,
Because you're making the separation, it makes me think that we are now
Right.
requiring
It
those
does
2
sound like
hours.
2 hours to me too.
So I just want to make sure we capture whether we want that or not.
no, we don't want
Okay.
that.
Okay.
We want to say if you're only working 4 hours a week,
You only need-
basically your primary or co-supervisor does double duty. It's direct supervision and it's 1 hour
2 birds, 1
a
stone.
week. Huh?
2 birds, 1 stone.
And would that include, capture that whole thought?
Well, that's what we were saying earlier, but we changed that because it might not be, the primary supervisor might not be the one doing the direct supervision, right? Or is it
Yeah.
always a primary supervisor during the direct supervision?
No.
It's not.
Not in practical.
Well, practicum doesn't count.
Well, I thought we were talking about all supervision.
But we're not,
We don't
we're
count
talking about
practicum.
SPE, all
Okay.
SPE.
Okay.
Practicum has nothing to do.
Okay, but do we see co-supervisors then often outside the context, I guess in pre-doctoral internships?
Well,
There are
people
some-
who aren't clinical psychologists aren't going to see co-supervisors,
Right,
but are going to see co-supervisors. So you're talking about consulting psychologists, IO psychologists,
Right.
they might be more likely to have a co-supervisor. Because they're going to be working in organizational settings and stuff like that, and you may not have.
well, we've had enforcement cases before, where without respect to the specifics of this enforcement cases, where some supervision was being provided by postdoc to
Right.
pre-doc, correct? So that would be a
Correct.
co-supervisor. They weren't necessarily licensed at the time that they were providing.
But that
supervision.
typically will happen in an internship setting, or it could happen in a practicum or something like that, and that person's supervision, that person, because they're a graduate student still or something like that, they're
Doesn't
not a
count towards
co-supervisor, correct,
Okay.
yeah. So it happens, but that's a whole different thing, it's not counted in here. So are we
I still don't think we've in any way clarified the 10%. I mean, I don't mean to be
well, I do.
a B word
I
about it,
think
but
it's clearer.
training should be for of the total time work each week with their primary delegated or co-supervisors. Okay, well, I worked 44 hours. I got 4.4 hours of supervision. That's how I would read that.
Okay, that's fine. You can read it that way.
But that's the way, I'm not the only one that's gonna read it that way. And
I know,
that's not
but
our
what-
intention. Our intention is that if they work 40 hours, they get 4 hours of supervision.
That's correct.
So that's
And so
what the
and that's
language
what
needs
we're
to say.
saying. We're saying that 44 hours a week will be credited, including the required 10% supervision. So basically, we are saying the maximum you can work is 40 hours, but you get your 4 hours of supervision, and we will count 44 hours.
So quick question, would they make it more clear if after a maximum of 44 hours per week, which includes supervision, will be credited? Would that make it a little tighter? Because I feel like with Dr. Horn on this one, I feel like that second sentence clarifies that includes that calculation. But if we added that phrasing to that other sentence, would that help make it clearer?
Or do we say of the 44 hours in a maximum of 4 hours for that 44 hours will be in supervision?
But is that true if you have 10 hours and 30 hours?
Can I throw something out of left field? Perhaps
Please.
staff and legal counsel can we're not gonna get through this, so we do have a little extra time. And in order to maybe move on to other issues, because this seems to be a sticking point, why doesn't staff work with legal counsel? We'll try and come up with another proposed section here for your consideration at the next committee meeting. Would that be something the committee might want to consider?
Yes.
That's good. I mean, y'all did a good job, but this part is still unclear. We are gonna bring it to the stakeholders, but we want something clear here, so at least we have an idea what we're saying.
I think given the breadth of the discussion today, we will have another committee meeting before we have a stakeholders meeting, just so we can make sure. It might not actually be a bad idea to go through all of the pathways language, just as a recap.
Yes.
It's been a while, we've been working on this incrementally. It might be a good fresh look to start from the beginning and kind of go through, and then we'll present some revised language for your consideration at the next committee meeting. And then we'll schedule the stakeholder licensing meeting after one more committee meeting. That'll be our internal goal, if that pleases the committee.
And it's understood by staff and by legal counsel that what we're talking about is a 10-to-1 ratio. Okay, so, which adds up to 11. It's not 100%, it's not 90% plus 10%, it's 100%, and then 10% of that 100%. Okay.
Okay.
It pleases the committee in my perspective, and I just feel like as you guys do this, the questions that you guys come up with, I think would be great to document that. 'Cause I think those are the kind of questions that we can use for facilitation with our wonderful team that does that. But I just feel like this is an interesting part because you could interpret it different ways. Because
And-
I wouldn't think 110%, I'd think 100.
And I'm also thinking, that'd be 9-to-1. Yeah, which I'd be,
Okay.
and that's,
All right,
okay.
so let's let them come up with something. I think that's a great idea, and let's move on because we have basically less than an hour before this committee ends, and it'd be nice to get somewhere further. Get somewhere further. I didn't mean to.
This just seems like it might be a good stopping point on this issue to bring back to the next
I
committee.
totally agree. So if we move on, for me, I'm looking at still page 4, I guess, but I just have a question on line 21, statutory authority under which the trainee will function. Does that mean what statute? So that means does it mean like is this a psych assistant or is this a registered psychologist?
Where are you?
Line 21, page 4.
Page 4.
statutory authority under which the trainee will function. What
I
is
think that's
that?
registered psychologist or psychological assistant.
Okay, so we're talking about essentially the category or the title, right?
I think we're talking about 2913 and 2909.5 here.
Or
and what they're
29,
referring-
or 2911 or 2910,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was just a question I had, so I didn't.
So it is referring to the type
Type.
Yeah.
position that they're occupying.
I like our flow chart.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any more on that page for folks? Disabilities, supervisors. Let me see where I am. Where's the 1387.1? Responsibilities of supervisors, right above that. Plan submitted by the trainee for approval shall be signed by da-da-da-da-da. It's page 6, the bottom of page 6, lines 33 to 40. I put here that this should mimic the psych assistant language. Because don't we have something like this for psych assistants? As part of the plan. This is for GAP psychologists, general applied psychologists, and we have something like this for psych assistants, what their plan has to include, and I think they ought to essentially be the same.
The psych assistant plan is the same as every plan.
I'm sorry?
The psych assistant plan is the same. I mean, it's the same as any supervised experience. It's not a separate plan for psych assistants.
If they're a psych assistant, it doesn't, if they're in someone's office, it doesn't require, they're working under an individual psychologist, doesn't require pre-approval?
We don't have that.
I mean, or a plan?
They all do. All of
Okay,
them
well,
do.
then this plan should, the things in this
Okay.
plan ought to be the same as in any other plan.
Just so I'm clear, when we say approval of the plan, we're seeing that each of these elements is present in the plan.
Yeah,
Staff member's not evaluating
that's right.
whether it's a good plan or a bad
That's
plan.
right.
It's just that there's a plan in
Right, there's
place
a
that
plan in
covers
place.
all these categories. Okay.
And don't we have that for other categories, that they have to have a plan?
Just the regular one. There's only the one in 1387. What was B10 now is 6, I think, on this.
Yeah, I was gonna say on page 4, number 6,
Yeah.
lines 19 through 32 has what's required of the agreement for the
Mhm.
trainee.
Okay.
Are you saying you want to mirror the plan with the agreement?
Well, shouldn't it be? I mean, are we saying for general applied psychologists that they have to submit a plan that has to be pre-approved?
Yes, they have to.
Now, why didn't we say that about psych assistants who are working for psychologists in private practice?
We did, but we didn't have specific requirements for the plan. It was just the same as 1387.
Okay, well, then if it's the same, then I think this ought to be the same. So, I mean, I think if we're having people do pre-approval, I think we want the elements of the plan to include the things we need. And we might want to change something earlier, we might want to check this, but I think what we're looking for are the same elements regardless of where the person is working or what kind of a person, what kind of plan, you know what I'm saying, what kind of psychologist that person is, or psychological experiences that person is getting.
That's part of the agreement.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if page 4 is our other thing,
Okay.
it's the
So make it
agreement you're
consistent?
talking about? Or here we are.
That's the agreement, then
Well, the plan is part of the agreement. It's the questions that are a part of the agreement, where we have the 3 questions that we ask within that agreement. We say on a separate piece of paper, describe, and that's the plan portion of the agreement.
So on the plan or the agreement, do we say it has to be signed by all the parties involved, that it had, all that kind of stuff? Okay, then I think don't
Just
we
make
want
that
that here too? I mean, don't we want both of them to have the same thing?
And the current verification of experience package that is going through final review right now has deletion of the requirement of the pre-approval of the plan for psych assistance. So just kind of keeping that in mind as you guys look at this. That's what the current package eliminates, is the pre-approval of the plan is still required, and it has to be signed and dated
Okay.
before the experience takes place, but it doesn't have to be submitted to the board for approval prior to
In
the
that type of
experience.
setting, in that one
Then
specific.
I'm not sure we should require that these be submitted for pre-approval.
I think that's right. I don't think we should require anything differently of a different group of people that
I
are
don't
also
either.
trying to seek hours toward the licensure. If I recall correctly, the reason we didn't want to do pre-approval of the plan was it put the licensing staff in a position of evaluating kind of the merits of the plan, and that felt uncomfortable
We
as
just
you.
wanted to ensure
That
that
there was
the
a plan
plan
in
was in
place.
place.
Right.
And that was really the reason for it.
Well, and also if there's not a licensed psychologist at that setting and getting a co-supervisor, so you have that added element that you don't normally have.
Right.
And I think that's why we were requiring the pre-approval of those non-mental health services plans. So we ensured that there's the co-supervisor that's qualified and all, and so we're just taking a look at it.
But if they have it in place and they know they need a co-supervisor, then I think that
That we shouldn't have to do
I
pre-approval.
think they should not have to do pre-approval.
But what if there can be a primary supervisor in a non-mental health setting that is not licensed?
Correct.
And they have to get a co-supervisor who is,
Okay.
to oversee.
So that's why the co-supervisor in some settings is responsible.
Okay.
The committee might want to consider deleting the last 2 sentences on page 6, starting with line 29, about the plan must be submitted by the trainee and approved by the board prior to commencement of the SPE. SPE accrued prior to the approval of the plan will not meet licensure requirements and will be denied.
Well, it should even start at 27. Submit a supervision plan and submit the plan to the board for approval on a case-by-case
Right.
basis. That's not what we want to do.
Can't we just delete this whole section?
Yeah, if they're not going to require it, yeah.
It's actually not approved after the fact. We just need to have it in place, and we just want to know it's in place.
So then we can just delete sub D, because that's the only thing that was different, is because we were requiring them to submit a plan in advance. So they would just meet the requirements of page 4, subsection 6, just like everybody else.
Perfect. That's what we want to do. And that means we're going to have to change earlier where we say people who are gap psychologists look to this area, because they don't need to look to that area anymore.
Right.
Are y'all okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know where that is?
Or do you want to just strike it all out and?
Strike it out then they'll think it's existing language.
We might want to strike it out and put a comment box to ensure that the gap settings is referenced in an earlier section.
Okay.
But eventually, if we're going to present this package for regulatory approval, since this is brand-new language, it would.
The plan will be in
It would
there.
disappear from the package.
Right.
Yeah, okay,
Right.
okay.
Where we have responsibilities of supervisors on page 7, again, we have that they ensure that each, yeah, we've got it written much better here to how we were changing it before. I just want to make sure that, you know, before we said that it's not the supervisor who does the informing, but the supervisor ensures that the person is informed, and we have it right there,
Right.
1387.1. When we changed that earlier today.
But I guess I do have a question. Excuse me. On line number 8, primary supervisor is still there, but we've stricken
What page?
page number 7, I'm sorry, of that section that you were referring to a second ago. Line number 7, we have some reference of primary supervisor 7 on line 11, number 8. We've stricken primary from line 1 as the head of the section, and I know that one of the comments about the notion about the co-supervisor, I think, is over there, I think. I can't find it now, but that whole idea of, does it need to be a distinction between primary?
Well, we've done that. Actually, A is primary supervisors shall do, and then we'll have B, it's,
It's on the other side.
yeah, let's see.
Yes.
Oh, no, we put all the supervisors there, but we talk about what different ones require, right? Let me see.
I know we talked about that in the section before, supervision requirements, but I don't know if we needed to have it there also.
Is this the qualifications of all the supervisors? No, it's only the licensed, the ones
I
who
think-
are licensed.
If you
Well,
go to,
actually, I
it's in-
think, as I understand the regulations, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Johnson, it's only the primary supervisor who needs to do this course every 2 years.
Well, it could be the co-supervisor, couldn't it? If the co-supervisor is a licensed psychologist.
It doesn't make that clear.
Right.
I know for delegated supervisors,
No, they're not.
they're not required to do it.
If the
Yeah,
primary supervisor isn't licensed.
Co-supervisor on page 11, line 17. Requires the.
what? 17?
17.
Yeah,
It requires the course.
there you go.
Okay.
Yeah,
For the
good,
co-supervisor.
good, perfect.
Oh, I see, we put the two of them together.
Yeah, it's all supervisors.
Yep,
and
previously
talk about it.
1387.1 was primary supervisor, 1387.2 was delegated. So what we did is just create 1387.1A to describe the responsibilities of the primary supervisor. 1387.1B is primary, and 1387.1C is co-supervisor. So all the supervisors are listed in one section.
What we were doing,
Okay,
it was
so-
eliminating a lot of duplicative.
There's a
sorry.
lot of
So-
Language.
duplication.
So I guess my only question would be, is it buried, and can people find it? Because I think that in terms of those headers about the different ones, so I look here, it's saying supervise no more than 5, like on the end of page, I don't know what line it would be, towards the end. So I just would wonder if you could look at that to make sure it's clear, the distinction, because I do think having them separated before, you knew the difference between the primary and co-supervisor. Or delegated supervisor is how I read before.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but we put it all together so that it flowed from here's your primary responsibilities, and that you may delegate, and then the responsibilities of those dedicated people all in one section, so it was all supervision requirements and the flow of that authority.
I think just the way it's numbered,
Yeah.
nothing's indented, everything starts the same, nothing's bolded or anything. It does make it, it's like, where do we look? Do we have to look through this whole thing? So I can appreciate what you're saying. Do we, is there any way that we can indent some, or is that not allowed? Or can we bold some, or is that not allowed?
Well, that's not how
Generally-
they're printed in the,
Yeah, Westlaw does not print it in that fashion,
Yeah.
no.
Okay.
Well, or though, like for instance, we have, how you start off like the 1381.1, number A, you start off with primary supervisors, the next section should start off with code supervisors. I'm just saying, not even the indented, but just like to start you start off that first line saying primary supervisors shall comply with the following requirements. I think the sentence same should start with the
At the
co-supervisors.
co-supervisor part, where you start that.
So section C should start with the
Yeah.
Yeah, so
co-supervisors?
Yeah.
it's just consistent.
Good, that's a good way to do it. Can I also say for this same part, page 9, number 13, we want to change that language to be the way we have said it earlier. It's that the supervisor has the kind of experience and training required to be able to supervise the trainee.
So the language would parallel it.
Yeah, what we said earlier. What we said earlier today, remember we switched those things?
1391.6.
Oh, sorry.
I have a couple questions in the sections that we're talking about, but I don't know if you want to go through all the way to the end of primary supervisor, Dr. Horn, before I ask my questions. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I thought we were okay. I thought your affirmation was, yeah, let me get through to the end of my comment. There was a question raised here in the comments on the side. I don't know if those are more for stakeholder discussion or if they're for discussion by us, as to whether if somebody has a history of past discipline, whether that should be something that they have to notify their their supervisee about, as opposed to, obviously, if they have current discipline or they're having trouble, they're losing the license or they're on probation or whatever. I don't think we've reinstated somebody's license or their license is now current, they're no longer
Under
subject.
probation.
No longer under probation, unless we put a limitation in there that they can never supervise ever again or something like that, which doesn't really happen, except within the context of probation, then I don't think they should have to.
Oh, I don't either.
I don't think they should have to disclose that. I mean, they've done the time for the crime, so
Right.
I think they should be able to function fairly freely in that context, since there's no ongoing limitations with them. On page 8, 27 through 30, where we take out the couldn't be a prior client. This is on page 8, lines 27 through 30, where we take out sections K and L. Is that because it's already contained in the APA ethics code? That this is not permissible, or is it okay for them to have take on a prior client, a psychotherapy client?
We've said that they have to be in compliance with the Code of Ethics, and it's in the Code of Ethics.
Oh, so that's why we're taking them out, not because we're
Is that why
saying
they were
we're
taken out? 'Cause
flagging
we
people, it's okay to do
No.
that.
Recommending
Okay.
leave it in because we couldn't find it
That's
anywhere
good.
else.
Well, they won't know we're saying anyway, because it's going to be out.
Okay. That's why you want to take it out. Okay.
And we don't need to say, I suppose, we say with the compliance with the ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct as published with the American Psychological Association. It's implicit in that we're talking about the current code with all the current amendments.
Right. That's
Because
what-
there's more amendments coming out this
Right.
year.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's
So-
always,
Okay,
we don't understand that.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, so,
I'm talking about the 2016 torture amendments to the APA
right,
ethics code.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, 13 now, a delegated supervisor. I have a question about a delegated supervisor. Online,
Do you mind if the committee considers the other comment boxes, so we just make sure
no,
we've
of course
addressed?
not. Where are we?
On page 7, so the first one was, this is about the 6-hour course in supervision, and the one thing staff wanted input on was what you wanted out of the language. Should documentation, I think that might have been your comment, Dr. Horn, about documentation provided upon request, or some kind of self-certification? How do we prove that the 6-hour course was taken? Right now, it's in the psych assistant application that they meet the 6-hour coursework requirement.
And it's in the agreement.
It's in the agreement, okay. And then the other question was, do the courses have to be APA, CPA, or ACCME approved courses, or could they be any courses? I think we just wanted to know a little bit more substantively what you wanted out of that coursework requirement.
I definitely think the course should meet, whoever's providing the course has to meet our requirements for approved people who can, or approved.
Continuing education
Yeah,
providers.
who can provide continuing education. So we definitely want that. And the proof is the completion, you know, they have a certificate of completion for any CE that they've done.
And I'm just wondering, because I think that it should mirror that language, like for the CPD, and I don't know if it's coursework or however we do it, but it should be similar, I think. You know, because I think we would want it to be the same.
Whatever we call continuing education in the CPD.
Yes, for the
part,
course, and
yeah.
I can't remember if it's coursework or course.
I can't remember either.
But 6 hour, yeah, okay. So we're okay there on that part?
Ms.
So do you-
Eberhard, are you clear on that part? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I know it's not public comment.
Yes.
About that.
You may.
Do you mean one course, or is it possible to take, you know, because we do 2 hours and 2 hours and 2 hours, so it'd be important to clarify that, I think.
I think that's why we were just talking about that. I think if we said coursework, it'd be 6 hours total, yeah,
Or 6 hours of.
of coursework, yeah,
Or 6 hours of continuing professional development.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So people know that they can put it together, each one.
Thank you. We okay?
Dr. Horn, I have a question. Of the sections we've looked at so far, just given the time of the day,
Yeah.
should we ask them if there's any public comment? Because I feel like, I know we wanted to get through this whole section, but I don't want us to go the whole afternoon and not have any time.
Well, I think that's a good idea. So,
Can-
you know, we have what, a page, and we have 2.5 pages, well, we have more than that, so. Yeah, let's stop here, and let me just see, is there been any public comment about anything that we've talked about at this point as we're going through this Pathways to Licensure 1387?
Just to that point, Joe Lindercrow with CPA, just to that point, I'm not sure, Jason, that you captured that last bit. So I think, what did you,
Complete 6 hours of coursework.
coursework or continuing professional development?
Continuing professional development.
So it would be,
Do we want to make a 6-hour course?
shall complete 6 hours of continuing professional development in supervision. Is that what you, is that right?
I was saying, I thought it was coursework, because I think for the courses, the way it's written in the CPD, which I can't remember off the top of my head right now, I think it says coursework.
Okay.
But I think it's instructive that you said that not all of them are 6 hours.
Yeah.
There's 2, so I would say, we don't want to say course if there's not a 6-hour course.
6 hours of coursework
Work, yeah.
in
But I'm not
supervision.
I can't remember how it's written in the.
But we don't want it to be just any CPD. I mean, I think this would be different from peer consultation or something like that. I think we.
So you want to say coursework
We
then?
really want it to be in the
Yes.
kind of continuing education.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's an important distinction, I
Right.
think, for people when they're meeting this particular requirement, so.
Right. Okay, yeah, thanks. So but I think coursework gives us the opportunity to, it doesn't have to be a 6-hour course. It can be.
Yeah, but the only thing I'm remembering too, because I think we do consider that continuing education coursework, right?
Well, I think that's how it's been. I think, yeah, prior to now, it's been 6 hours of CE course. It's been continuing
I think that's a good point, because if you want it to be, you were just saying you want it to be approved,
Right,
then it would fall under
CE.
continuing education, or what sponsored continuing education.
That's what really should.
Right,
then like-
whatever term you ended up with, right,
That's right, that's right.
whatever you
Right now,
ended.
it's called sponsor approved.
Right now it
And
is.
they changed that name.
But,
It's been
but
taken
whatever
away.
that category ends up being called, so in other words, it's not independent study, and it's not
It's not just reading.
reading a journal article on
So let's say
supervision.
sponsor approved continuing education. Yeah,
Okay, for the-
6 hours of sponsor approved.
That's right.
Continuing education.
And it doesn't have to be one.
Right.
I don't think there's anything in there that would imply that it has to be one, because. people do
Not
that.
unless you say a course,
Right.
a 6-hour
Right,
course.
you could do an
Then-
hour and a half at
as
one
long as you
convention,
don't say
hour and a half
that,
at
then,
another convention,
right.
4 hours somewhere
Right.
else.
Yeah, we want that because, yeah, sponsor approved, because we know there are really things about supervision that people need, we want people to know.
Well, right, and we know, just practically speaking, we do a 2-hour supervision course every time at our convention. Our Division of Education and Training does a specialized 2-hour, or actually full-day supervision course every year. And people sometimes take that, or they take, that plus something else. They usually get more than the 6, but just so that it's clear.
That's good.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Would the committee want to consider using the language from our coursework in suicide risk assessment and intervention and refer back to the statute, which is 2915C2 or 3, and that would be academic or sponsored CE? Could the supervision
I don't think
be
so. I don't
obtained
think
in an
that-
academic environment or no?
Because it doesn't academic also include self-directed study?
Well, academics different,
Mhm.
yeah, it's different. I don't think, no, she's talking about the continuing education. I mean, what we just did about
Continued
suicide.
professional- yeah.
And I think, no, we want this, people aren't gonna get this in an academic setting. This
No.
is very specific, and that's what we want people to get, the theory of supervision and all that kind of stuff.
Although there are programs that have that part of their curriculum,
Yeah,
but not
Yeah.
many, and that's not where we want them to
Right.
get it.
right.
I just have a question. We took the word coursework out. Does sponsored approved continuing education imply coursework?
That will be fine.
Yeah, okay.
I actually had the same thought. I was thinking, we'll keep it as is, but just keep our eye on that one, 'cause I feel like course or courses or coursework should be there, but in mirroring how we did
Yeah,
CPD, because
yeah.
for the courses, we did say sponsor approved continuing education courses is how we kind of labeled it, but in this case, it could be more than one, but I'm cool with that as it is, but I'm in agreement with you that we want to focus on courses, not the other approaches.
If you want to reference the CPD, it just says instruction, so it's sponsored CE instruction is
Okay.
the title of it.
Is that the final version that we have?
That's what I have in the booklet, yeah. So that acceptable CPD includes these things, and that includes sponsored CE instruction. So if that's
I
what you would
think
like.
this is fine. Let's see where we're
Okay.
All right.
Put a comment and put question mark instruction then, so we don't lose it. Because I think we should try to be consistent if we're using the language.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we can take away some of these comments, right? Because we've
Yeah.
answered them, or we've included them here.
So the documentation will be in the SPE form, so that takes care of the first comment.
Is that GJ6?
Right.
4, GJ4. And then, do the courses have to be APA, CPA, or ACCME?
No. It's like you've done it. She's got the old one, you've got a new one, so you did it right.
Okay, this one.
Ignore me.
This
That
one
fir-
here.
That first comment there. Oh, my gosh. No, we're doing it up there, so. Why don't we have them, no, let's just have them certify under penalty of perjury, just like we do every other requirement, and they'll keep their documentation of it for 4 years. So that gives us plenty of time if there's anything to look at while they're primary supervisors.
So no
Right.
change and delete the comment.
Delete the comment.
Okay. Now we're on to
This says six years. Makes sense, actually.
6 years from the date of completion, yeah. Mhm.
And then it's current discipline.
Yeah, current discipline.
That was discussed already?
Yeah, current discipline
Dr.
only.
Phillips, yeah.
Yeah. We're not gonna put a red
Their
A, we're
current
not gonna have them walk
status.
around with a red A on it.
Have
So we
you
get rid of-
ever?
Where are we putting current?
Any,
So instead of any, we're putting current here?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask Ms. Marks if we could replace any with current, and that would cover it.
How about any current disciplinary action?
okay.
Because they have,
I like that.
So if
Leave
they
any
have
in.
one pending against them, they should also be
yeah,
informed.
any current disciplinary action,
Yeah.
and then take out your comment.
Should we say current
Yeah,
or
I think-
pending?
No, current is,
I think pending is a problem.
Yeah.
yeah,
Is it?
it just has to be current.
I mean, that should prove to be anything, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, exactly, so,
But current disciplinary action to me sounds like a disciplinary action that could be pending.
it could be, that's how I think people might read it.
It could be pending, but as long as there's an accusation on file, I think that would make it current. That's, what do you think?
Oh, if,
It could be pending in
This
the
is the level-
is that what
process.
you were intending?
I mean, if they have an accusation, wouldn't we want to know that? Because that's current, it's public, it's a formal action.
But
That's
it's,
not pending, that's just current.
but there's
right?
no, there's no, restriction on the person's license at that point.
So you wouldn't want the trainee notified unless there was probation or revocation
Well, are we talking
or
about notification, or are we talking about some actual inability to,
Anything that
supervisor.
restricts their license,
It would be
that's what we're-
well, an accusation, unless there's an ISO or PC 23, there's no restriction on the license.
Well, I'm gonna just,
And actually
If
theoretically,
somebody's
it's
in
not.
probation, we want people to know. If,
but if
obviously,
somebody's got a serious accusation that's been filed by the board against them, and you're their trainee, working under their license, wouldn't you want to know that the board has expressed concern about the behavior of your supervisor to the point where they've actually filed an accusation against them? I think on behalf of the trainees, I would argue, yeah, I think I'd want to know that.
So I think there is a question about whether or not you're trying to say that you cannot supervise unless you have a certain status, or whether or not you are required to notify the trainee of a particular action that the board has taken. I think those are two different things, and the board
And I think, what I'm talking about is notification to the trainee, not necessarily that it disables you in any way from continuing to supervise them.
I don't have a problem with requiring that the trainee be notified. I think it is a problem if you try to restrict the activities of the licensee
Oh, yeah.
when there has been no.
no, we're not trying
Yeah,
to do that.
yeah, yeah.
We're notifying, that's all we're talking about. Okay, so is this okay?
I think I agree with that, although when I read what was stricken, if we don't explicitly state that, I don't know if I would necessarily read an accusation as disciplinary action.
I think you need to work on that a little bit, because so that the license must be valid and active and free of any current disciplinary action, and then they need to notify the trainee of any I think you'd have to, you might even just say that whether or not an accusation has been filed or something along those lines.
So do we want to say on line 18, current formal disciplinary action, or say free of any current disciplinary action?
In which an accusation has been filed.
Well, just wait a minute. And shall immediately notify the trainee of any, like whether any, if there are any changes.
Discipline has been initiated by the board or something.
Yeah, any action taken by the board or something like that.
Because I think there's a difference between, as I said, between the notification and then the actual restriction of the status of the license.
Right.
So I think you can require that they notify the trainee of any action that's being initiated by the board. Do you think that works?
Of any, yeah, disciplinary action initiated by the board.
But I would think
I
it
take
actually
out
would need.
formal after current on line 18.
There's a difference in my mind to them getting a cite and fine and having an accusation filed against them.
Right, and the citation is not considered discipline. It's considered enforcement, but not discipline.
Okay,
Right.
okay.
So this would cover an accusation, an interim suspension, or a PC 23, where the board has initiated an action on the licensee, and we're requiring that they notify the trainee of that action.
I think it would, yes.
Yes, sir, I'm sorry, I missed what you just said.
This would include, disciplinary action that's initiated by the board would include a PC 23 order, which stops their practice. It's just, PC is Penal Code 23. An interim suspension order where they're immediately suspended from their practice, or an accusation has been filed. So they would be required to notify their trainee of that discipline initiated by the board.
And in some cases, that particular action, potentially an ISO or PC 23, would indeed, I think, restrict their ability to be a supervisor,
Right.
depending on the degree of restriction that's included in the order. Some of the restrictions are not, thou shalt not practice, they are more tailored. So it could do double duty in some cases, not the accusation.
So I guess when I hear the question about you'd want to know if you had an accusation filed, I would wonder, would you want to know, though, if an enforcement matter had taken place? I mean, if it's public knowledge, I mean, kind of what you answered earlier, Ms. Zurich, about, well, it is public about an accusation. It sounds like, I don't know if that's something that would be important to add here as well. And that's, I was, I missed.
Like a cite and fine?
Yeah, I missed your comment, 'cause I was talking on the side to Dr. Phillips, sorry. But I feel like we were saying, he was like, well, what he would do is always go online and check. Anyway, but I guess for that whole kind of conversation, though, if it's public knowledge, would that also be important to include enforcement as well?
So you're talking about administrative actions. So if someone failed to meet their CE requirements, or they didn't renew timely, you would want that to also be communicated?
They got a letter of
I
approval.
don't think that should be. It's not considered
A letter of
discipline.
approval, a letter of reprimand is a consequence of a formal disciplinary action, but generally, there's no restriction on the license, so I'm not sure I would call that you're under a formal discipline at that point.
I think we need to be more precise in our use of language in this particular area, so it's clear what exactly we're saying.
Okay, so why don't we do this? It's roughly 10 to 5. We have to stop by 5. We want to be more precise here. We're, again, we're trying to, I think, wordsmith and come up with stuff, and I think we just have to say, I'm going to suggest that we stop here because we got stuck and not go further at this point. We'll begin here next time. And head on through. What do y'all think?
So we're going to stop on page 7 of the,
Of these old ones, I mean, we've changed
Of the
things
marked up
here, so.
text.
We're gonna stop at, line 17 to 22, which may change, well,
okay.
right, next time, because we don't know, we've added stuff and all like this. But anyway, so they may change, but here's where we're gonna start next time, about possessing and maintaining a valid active license, free of any discipline. Okay.
And I think part of the challenge we have as a committee, and I'm not faulting the committee, because I think we're trying to be very careful and deliberate about the way we do this and make sure that they're clear regulations and, them all the stakeholders meetings and get any kind of clarification that they require. But we'll also have to revisit the language regarding the 10%.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
So, I mean, we're still going to be,
We
have
got
a fair
language to
amount of,
revisit, yeah.
That's the link that staff will review.
Yeah.
we're still going to have a fair amount of pathways to licensure to get through.
Right. Okay, then, is there, we're gonna stop here, obviously, we didn't get through, our, pathways to licensure, and we still have our continuing professional development to get through, and now we have to wait till our next licensing committee meeting, which will be after this, next board meeting, or November board meeting. So now we're talking into next year. I'd like to recommend that it be a 2-day meeting, just because we can't do it in one day.
That starts at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. It starts at 8, yeah, or 9, we'll say 9, give it people a 9 o'clock, I mean, I just think we have to do it, we have a lot to do, and we want to finish this, this is.
Well, I'm going to suggest if we're going to do that, have a 2-day meeting, that we schedule it similar to the way that we schedule board meetings, and as a Thursday and a Friday. Because by the time I'm done with that 2-day meeting, if I have 3 days of work ahead of me, I feel like I've been run over by a Mack truck. So at least I'd have the weekend to recuperate.
Yeah.
So maybe we can take that into consideration if we're going to do a 2-day meeting. And it screws my schedule up either way, because Tuesdays and Thursdays are both bad days for me.
It screws my
so-
schedule up either way
Yeah, right,
also.
right. And I'm sure Nicole's got commitments coming out of her.
But I just
Briefcase.
think we just clearly need that time. We hadn't expected that what we took up earlier would have taken as much time, but it did. So, and we want to take our time and do it right. So 2 days, everybody okay with that? Thursday and Friday's our recommendation. When this starts getting scheduled for after the first of the year.
But I would also suggest, I feel like it would be more helpful to go ahead and schedule 2 maybe, because I feel like it'd be better to cancel as opposed to try to then schedule. Because I think it was hard to schedule this one.
Yeah.
So if we could figure out a way to, because I feel like we thought we were.
Or you mean 2 one-day meetings?
2 2-day meetings.
2
I feel like
two-day
we've
meetings, okay.
been very ambitious to try to get through it. And if we cancel it, it would be fantastic, but I feel like it's just harder to then readjust and schedule, because we also have, board meetings
Yeah.
too. So I just, that's my suggestion.
I think that's a good idea.
I think, honestly, just for the benefit of all of us, I think we want to reach an end point, and somehow this feels like we're kind of like trudging through this over and over and over again. So perhaps that approach of doing 2 2-day meetings, I can't believe I'm saying this, would be the most effective to make sure that we actually got through this. So we could actually get some of this material out there, for instance, for stakeholders meetings and so on and so forth. So, but hopefully in those 2 2-day meetings, we can make our way through this as well as
CPD.
CPD.
I think we absolutely should be able to, I believe.
And one last thing, Dr. Horn, and the one thing I will say though, in terms of was just scheduled times and meetings, I feel like the most productive day that we actually did have, unfortunately, was Super Bowl Sunday. And so I feel like as we figure out ways to do this, because I know that people have different schedules and stuff, that we figure out a way that we started early, we were able to spend a lot of time, but figure out how we can do this would be really good, because I do think that we do need to then have our calendar for our other meetings. And so if that's an option as well, that might be a worthwhile one.
Super Bowl Sunday? Again?
Not necessarily Super Bowl Sunday, I'm just saying.
A Sunday, Monday?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because people have professional commitments during the week or something. I don't know. I hate to do that, but I feel like in terms of being able to get through it, that was our most productive day in this committee this year, so.
Well,
Sunday.
Be flexible like this.
What's that?
You're saying be flexible like this.
Dr. Lindercraft.
I just have a quick question, just to that point. The only thing I would say about a Sunday is that if you want to invite public comment, it's probably much more difficult for
Yeah, it'll
the
be-
public to be available on Sunday. But I just want to be sure I understood what you're saying. Are you saying that probably there will not be another licensing committee meeting this year, and it will go into 2017?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay. And then can you, right now, the CPD proposed regulations state sort of an implementation date of January 2019. Is there any way for us to know, just so I can answer questions about this, what that does to potential implementation of any changes that the board might approve? Do you think it pushes it to 2020?
I think it's going to push it up. I think we have to give the amount of time we say we're going to
Sure.
give. So I think whenever we finally finish and do that, we're going to push it.
It's about 2 years, about a 2-year period, is that right? After any formal, final approval,
Exactly.
including, and that's time for public comment and the board to consider comment and revise anything and then go out for comment again and then finally, so about 2 years,
So I would say
Right.
2020 would be
2020.
Probably.
more likely.
Okay.
And
I mean, it's
within
not,
that
too-
period,
I know we can't be
too,
Right,
certain.
we're having that period of overlap too.
whether it
Sure,
has to be
yes,
one,
transition.
one or the other.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so is there any other public comment at this point in time that people would like us to think about? We can't do anything here at this meeting, but we may put it on an agenda at a future meeting, or anything any more members of the public want to say? I'm sorry? Okay, we have one more thing before we adjourn.
I just want to welcome Connor Leitzel, who is the board's new student assistant, and have him stand up so the committee can say hello.
Hey, Connor.
Welcome,
Hi
Connor.
there. Welcome. Thanks.
And I'm sorry, and Stephanie Chung, I forgot this is your first licensing committee meeting as well as the new manager of the licensing unit. So welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie.
Stephanie and Connor, new staff members.
Thank you. All right, well, would you just let us know, Ms. Noonan, what we have that we said we want to talk about at subsequent meetings, and then I think we're ready to adjourn.
And Ms. Burns, if you would like to chime in if I missed anything. Okay, so future agenda item, I have a discussion of the one-time requirements, how those are met, how the board verifies compliance, in addition to our record-keeping timelines, polling stats, and how many people renew online versus by mail, so we can figure out how we can better maintain those records. I have for the suicide risk assessment language, when it's brought back to the board in November, to include additional supporting evidence that there is a need for this language. And that includes the chronology of the issue, a summary of Dr. Harlem's comments from the past board meetings, and then the opposed letter for 198. And then I have staff to draft a new form for the psych assistant to include at the November board meeting. And then also to include a section for the change of supervisor. And then I have for the section 1387, include suggestions, the other suggestions that were made to replace the term registered psychologist. And then the last two items I have schedule 2 more 2-day licensing committee meetings to go over the pathways and CPD. And then staff to draft new language for section 1387C 2 and 3. And that would cover the 44-hour max for the supervision, yeah.
And the sooner you can actually get on those, scheduling taking a look at the licensing committee, we don't need to wait till the November meeting.
Yeah, I'm gonna get on that
Okay,
tomorrow or
great, thank
sometime
you.
this week.
Thank you. Anything to add to that? Okay, then, are we ready to adjourn? Okay, the licensing committee is adjourning.